really strange, isn't it? And it should be so straightforward. It's not rocket science. So you come and test it, you come back, it doesn't work.
It must be all the energy in the room.
Our speaker for Saturday is going to be Dr. Simeon Hein. Dr. Hein is a former professor of statistics and research methods. He first became involved with remote viewing in 1996 and took a class as an open-minded skeptic. The surprisingly positive training results convinced Dr. Hein that a large area of scientific knowledge is withheld from public discussion. Subsequently, he began teaching remote viewing classes right up the road in Boulder, Colorado, which is where he's from. He also became interested in crop circles, UFOs, and extraterrestrials, and I was introduced actually to Dr. Simeon Hein's name back in the crop circle era, and ultimately remote viewing. Dr. Hein will look at the UFO Bigfoot connection and some fundamental characteristics common to paranormal phenomena, such as strange lights and orbs, sudden camera and battery failure, or IT failure, rapid temperature changes, and space-time distortions. He'll show how these specific experiences relate to coherent matter and research in low-energy nuclear reactions. Simeon will explain how witness descriptions and encounters with Bigfoot support these ideas as discussed in his new book, which he has back there, Dark Matter Monsters, Cryptids, Ball Lightning, and the Science of Secret Lifeforms. Dr. Hein is the director of a research and teaching company called the Mount Baldy Institute up in Boulder, founded in 1997 to give people the opportunity to learn remote viewing, a subject I'm fascinated with, a type of intuition training that taps into your unconscious intelligence. He also studies crop circles and has taken people on crop circle tours in the UK. So I'm proud to introduce Dr. Simeon Hein.
Thanks very much, Barry. Appreciate it. I was there with Ron Russell, and Claude Swanson, who's now passed on, was there. And I actually met Claude Swanson in the crop circles because he had heard Ron Russell and myself on the Art Bell show way back there, I think in '98. And he said, Claude, being the total pioneer he was, and the more I learned, the more I realized he was right, even though I didn't understand all the science that he was talking about back then, because he had a PhD from Princeton in physics, and it was way beyond, I'm a statistics teacher in sociology, but I've kind of caught up with Claude over the years. Claude came over and he said, I have to find Ron and Simeon. He did not know where we were. He somehow remote viewed our location and ended up at our hotel. And stumbles in the door one day in Marlborough, UK, in Wiltshire, and he says, I'm Claude Swanson, and I need to be working with you. I have to work with you. So we let him in on the tour. And Claude and I spent days and days walking around the crop circles with a static meter and some of his equipment taking measurements. And I still have all that videotape of me and him somewhere on high 8 film, which is what we used back then, before even digital was around, of me and Claude. So anyway, Claude, wherever you are, we're making progress, and you are on the right path, as I want to explain today. So what I want to talk about today is what I think are some of the connections between a lot of these phenomena, how I got involved in this subject. I never would have expected a number of years ago for all these topics to link up with some really common physics principles. But I'm going to explain to you my interpretation of how these phenomena are related, what we call paranormal phenomena, and some of that overlaps with UFOs, UAP also. If you don't agree with me on anything I say, that's fine. I'm not insisting you believe what I'm going to say. It's my interpretation of this based on my experience with remote viewing, crop circles, UFOs, and even some cryptid experiences and witnesses and people I know who've encountered. I guess there's some discussion whether Bigfoot is a cryptid or not, but that general area of sort of mysterious creatures and other types of life that we have on the planet that we really don't understand very much about. So I want to show you how this sort of links together from my point of view, and then during the questions we can discuss it. So my experience with all these phenomena started when I was like 11 or 12. My mom, who was a bird watcher, took myself and her to the Everglades. We were out there in, if you've been to really southern Florida, it's kind of marshy and it's, swamps and things in the Everglades. Yeah. And there, right overhead, was this really large object that I thought had to be the moon because it was as big as a full moon. And I told my mom, I said, Mom, look at the moon. And she looks in that direction where the moon was. It was just rising over the horizon. So I said, no, Mom, it's up there. And she looked and she goes, what is that? I can still remember it. We both had our binoculars. Now, without binoculars, it looked like an amorphous, perfectly round cloud. And I'm staring up at it, and we both had binoculars. Then we put the binoculars on it, and there were dots underneath on the bottom of whatever this was in the pattern of a Z. I guess for Zeta, or something like that. I guess nowadays Z has another meaning, but back then, it was a partially amorphous object, and it was like a cloud-like, but it had structure on it. Within a few seconds of us looking at it with our binoculars, it moved into a cloud. So it went from being totally stationary to moving rather quickly, I thought, as an 11-year-old or 12-year-old, into a cloud, and then it was gone. So we continue our bird watching, and it had a kind of a strange feeling. To me, even as a very young teenager, even pre-teenager, it just felt like something that didn't belong there. And in my mind, the only rational explanation I could come up with at the moment was that this could have been an exploded rocket from Cape Canaveral, some launch that went wrong, and they blew it up, right? So we go to the ranger talks, as they have in national parks. You may have been to some of these. And we're sitting in the front row. We're talking to the people next to us. We tell them what we saw. My mom was really excited. I didn't know anything about the topic at that age. And the people next to us had seen it. And they said, yeah, we saw it coming out of the cloud. So the ranger says, did anyone see anything interesting today? So my mom raises her hand. She says, yes, we saw a UFO. And the ranger says, did anyone else see anything interesting today? And then there was a blackout all of a sudden. The lights go out. So we listened to the ranger talk. My mom was not deterred by this. She went up and said, look, we saw something that was really large, structured, was right over us. And the ranger said, it was a weather balloon or something like this. So that was my early experience with this phenomenon. That was sort of the end of it. And I don't think I read too much apart from maybe book The Mothman Prophecies by John Keel. I think that was my only book I read as a teenager. Then I go off. I never really had much contact with the phenomena. I grew up in Westchester County, right next to the Hudson Valley. But that was in the early 70s. I did not find out that people in my high school class actually saw a triangular craft, the wrestling team, in 1978 or 9, before the Hudson Valley wave started. And I only interviewed the wrestling coach, who was there when I was in 11th grade, but I never talked to him. I probably passed him in the hall because I was not on the wrestling team. It sort of wasn't my thing. I was on the debate team. But and the co-captain the last year. But I talked to this guy, Vinny, and I interviewed him, and I put him on the interview on my YouTube channel. You can watch it. You can just look for my name. And Vinny said that they were coming out of Amerenik High School, which is not very far from Edgemont, and they saw this huge triangular craft maybe a half a mile up in the sky. The other kids in the class told me, I haven't talked to them about it yet, but people who talked to them said the reason they didn't talk about it is they were so frightened. One of the kids said it was the scariest thing he'd ever seen in his life. Huge black triangle over the high school gym. They're just coming out of the wrestling match. Then two fighter jets, I think Vinny said they might have been F-16s or something like that, come out of the direction of the Connecticut. He said the thing took off like the Starship Enterprise on warp drive in the direction of New Jersey. They call the police, and the police say there happens to be a blackout in the 4 towns closest to your location. Just started a few minutes ago. So go figure. But I didn't find out about this until a couple of years ago, but this would have been part of my experience in high school, even though nobody talked about it. So this is, look, as a sociologist, we call these things hidden events. People are experiencing it, but they don't talk about it. And so this is sort of what happened with me, too. So I go all the way through high school, college, graduate school. Never hear the word UFO, ever. I'm in graduate school and I hear about this thing called fractal geometry. Now, you probably know what fractal geometry was, but at the time, my graduate committee thought this was a real threat to how we do things in social science because it was connected to something called chaos theory. This area of mathematics that shows how little changes can create big effects, that things are not always linear. For some reason, and maybe it was this experience in the Everglades, I was attracted to fractal geometry. Fractals are objects that are the way nature looks, self-similar objects. Most of you are familiar with this idea now. The closer you look, the more detail you see. You can keep magnifying in on them. And they are scale invariant, which means it doesn't matter what scale you use, whether it's an inch or a micron or a meter. It looks like the patterns look the same. And so this describes things like clouds, like mountains, ranges, like the way rivers look, and the tributaries and the little branching streams that come out of rivers, and your hair and your bronchial structure and your cardiovascular system, the way it starts with big arteries, right? And goes to smaller and smaller veins and capillaries, and somehow the blood is kind of moves through your whole body through a fractal type network. And fractals are actually used practically in things we call JPEGs. Remember those JPEG images? Where you didn't have to transmit all of the data, you could compress it with a fractal algorithm. People that worked in this area ended up going into graphics. Michael Barnsley and others, who had written these books that taught me about fractals, went into the computer field for compression, satellite information compression, and so forth. So it has a real practical application. The definition of fractals mathematically are objects between dimensions. No joke. Interdimensional objects. Now, as a graduate student in the late 80s and the early 90s at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, that only meant what it meant mathematically. I wasn't interested in these topics back then. UFOs had kind of receded. I didn't go to a single UFO meeting. Somewhere along the way, I picked up Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret. I think it was in the University of Arizona bookstore. And that might have been because they had such a great astrophysics program there, and I would go to the astrophysics lectures once a week in their planetarium, which were amazing. And they talked about dark matter and all these really cool stuff, and quasars. I think that's where I saw Timothy Good's book. But anyway, I never talked to this subject was not on my radar at all, apart from just reading a little bit. I didn't have any more contact with it. I didn't know anyone involved. Nobody mentioned any of these topics all the way from kindergarten to PhD, I guarantee you. So, I study this fractal geometry, and I start looking at how it could apply as other ways of looking at how the world really works, because the models I was taught in social science were really linear. It was this sort of linear modeling where everything is just evenly proportioned. The models are based on fitting data out of straight lines, regression analysis, based on very kind of Euclidean shapes. Now, fractals are the opposite of these Euclidean types of objects, perfectly round spheres and squares and so forth. They're the way actually reality really looks. Now, us modern people, we like to impose very Cartesian coordinates and straight lines on everything. Just look at the way roads are built nowadays and cities and so forth. But that's not the way nature really does it. And so I was looking at this way back, and this was sort of my introduction to this whole area, was actually fractal geometry, because fractals are not just the shapes of objects, it's the patterns in time of how things oscillate, the energy that they give off. A lot of energy and frequencies of things that we're exposed to are also self-similar, like this sort of illustration shows, where things sort of look similar on any scale, whether it's a second, a year, or an hour. You sort of get the same patterns. And there's a name for this. It's called flicker noise, or the 1/f spectra. And it turns out that this type of noise is a signature of very interesting processes. One application, by the way, one illustration of fractals that you may have seen is the idea that things don't really have a fixed length. We're brought up to believe that, but the coastline of England example, which Mandelbrot used Benoit Mandelbrot, who worked for IBM and was looking at fractals in line noise. Because IBM was interested in how does line noise manifest itself, and he realized, Mandelbrot realized it kind of had this flicker noise 1/f spectra, which means there's a lot more variation in the high frequencies than the low frequencies. 1/f spectra noise is somewhere between white noise, which is really random, and brown noise, which is kind of correlated. It's actually called pink noise now. In any case, this illustration always kind of blew my mind, which is that you think you know the length between something, but it really depends on the size of your ruler, right? And smaller your ruler, the more detail you're going to find. And it turns out that the coastline of England is actually infinitely long once your ruler gets smaller and smaller, from feet down to inches, down to fractions of inches, the measurement system we use here in the US. As your ruler gets smaller, you're getting into spaces between rocks and then sand grains, right? So you'd actually end up with an infinite space. So basically, our idea of reality depends on sort of what measuring instruments we use. And these fractal objects were initially thought of as mathematical monsters 100 years ago. They did not like these. They wanted to get rid of them, but they came back because it's really how reality works. And we know that flicker noise, 1/f spectra, now is very important. Then this is sort of what it looks like. And it manifests itself in very interesting systems, living systems, where all the particles are correlated with each other. In other words, instead of having like a gear-like relationship where one gear goes into the next, if all the particles have sort of a quantum entanglement, you're going to end up with pink noise, because any one little particle could affect all the other particles. And the analogy for this in reality that we could understand is something like an avalanche. It's not always a loud noise that sets off an avalanche. It's any sort of noise that's at the right frequency. So we're talking here more about frequency than linear relationships. So being exposed to fractals, even before I came across the idea of remote viewing, which happened right here, as Barry said, when I was listening to KGNU, the community radio station, I heard Courtney Brown talking about the idea of remote viewing back in 1996. I was open to the idea that there may be phenomena that science hadn't really understood yet, because they were using linear methods like regression analysis, which I was taught to use and to teach, that there could be sort of other systems that were based on this flicker noise, on fractal dynamics, or systems where all the particles were correlated in some way. Right? This is not what we were taught in statistics. We were taught in statistics, you throw out the outliers. You throw it away. I remember this lecture in one of my supervisor's office. The data that doesn't fit the line, he said you're allowed to throw a few of those data points out because they don't fit. Yeah, even if it's the data point that really matters. You say, well, I have my idea how reality is. It's going to fit on this line. It's going to have a linear relationship. If it doesn't fit that, we're just going to toss it. Maybe like COVID, when only 10 people had it on the planet, right? Because it's an outlier, until it isn't. So that's the problem of using these mathematical systems, is we're throwing out data that may really matter. The outliers may be the most important thing. Hello? We just heard about the NDAA report, right? You could just say, well, they're outliers. We don't understand them, and we never will, because we don't want to. Because we want it to fit our understanding. So I was open to the idea of remote viewing. So when I heard Courtney talking about it in KGNU, I said, maybe this is sort of what I expected to find from my work in fractal geometry and statistics, is that there are other patterns there, like remote viewing being your ability to perceive something without using your physical senses, right? To describe it accurately, using some other process that you may not understand, but we can see from the data that people are really capable of doing this, as I found out when I took the class at the Farsight Institute back in 1996. So many of you are familiar with this idea, but back in the 90s, the program had just been declassified from the US government. It was declassified in 1995, so it was not really well known back then. And it's this ability to have a target picture that's hidden from the viewer, and they describe it on their page. If you've ever taken an RV class, as some of you have here in this room with me, and somehow you can really describe it really well using some sort of intuition, unconscious process, or something more where things are correlated even though your conscious mind can't see how it's actually doing this. So this was one process that immediately showed me that there was some sort of alternative processes going on that were definitely not linear, They weren't even obvious how it was happening, but you could see from these, cases, that's actually Ron Russell's session where you don't even know what you're doing. For example, when Ron was doing this particular session, and I was just talking with Elaine at back of the room. He was in one of my first classes. He's a former MUFON member, if I remember correctly. He didn't even think it was a car. He started second guessing himself, and here is a car, and he thinks he's in a stadium, which it was also a stadium. It's a car in a stadium. So you don't know what you're doing. It shows that there are other processes underlying reality. This is double blind, by the way. In case you think it's somehow that the monitor's mind is getting viewed by the viewer, that it's some sort of telepathy, psychic overlay. Even double blind, when you put nobody knows the picture until the end of the session, it's hidden from everybody, the viewer can still do a very good job. You can see the kind of the shapes are correct and everything. So here's the thing about RV that was really fascinating to me, even back in '96. This was one of the first books to come out about RV, Remote Viewers by Jim Schnabel, right? And he also did another movie called The Real X-Files, a documentary which you can still find on YouTube. So while they were testing Uri Geller, and you can learn more about this in this really good documentary called Third Eye Spies by Lance Mungia and Russell Tarr. You really should watch it if you're interested in the subject at all. Uri was their first test subject before Ingo Swann and Pat Price, because they had heard about him and there was some communication between SRI and the folks in Israel. And they knew there was this guy that had psychokinetic abilities and is also a very good remote viewer, and these things go together. And here's the interesting thing. If you read this book, and I just reread it again, right around Uri, when he was at Lawrence Livermore Labs and at SRI, they would see cryptids and UFOs and aports. I think it was Russell Targ who recovered one of his lapel pins that had been missing for 6 months, as you can see in Third Eye Spies. It just fell out of the air while they were walking on the beach. And then the other one showed up in an ice cream cone they were eating, an ice cream they bought at the beach. And Uri said he could do this. So these things, there's your lapel pins missing for months and months, and they fall out of the sky while you're. There were other really strange effects around Uri. They saw strange cryptid birds inside the homes of some of these researchers, kind of like you've heard about at Skinwalker Ranch with the hitchhiker effect. There was the classic little flying saucer flying around Lawrence Livermore Labs, inside the lab. And these are by people that may not have even known much about Uri or any of this sort of subject area, but here they're seeing, just like you saw in Lukatsky's book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, they're experiencing these so-called paranormal phenomena. It has to make you wonder, how would a remote viewer, someone really good at PK, why would this follow him around? Unless he's changing the space. Now Uri's ability, if you know anything about him, he said he was accosted by a ball of light in the garden of his apartment complex in Israel. That's where this all started. And a neighbor recently came forward recently. I saw him talking. He said, yeah, I saw it. Uri was running away. The ball of light was following him, and it caught up to him, and Uri goes unconscious, and he wakes up with all these abilities. So, go figure. That is how these topics start to be interrelated. Even though your mind and my mind wants to hermetically seal these topics off. Like, don't confuse your UFOs with my remote viewing protocol. Some people don't mix ghosts into my remote viewing. It's separate. It's a government program. It's serious. The intelligence agencies use this to get the bad guys. But you can't separate it out because these phenomena go together, as I want to show you why I think they go together in a few minutes. Crop circles. So how did I get interested in crop circles? Well, one of the targets we had in 1996 was this Julius set over at Windmill Hill in Wiltshire. I wasn't there that year, but I really got curious. I had never heard of crop circles before, honestly. It was a target in the RV class at the Farsight Institute. And I just felt I had to know more about these because in my RV session, I had gotten a lot of information that I couldn't really verify. Like maybe something extraterrestrial, strange energies, information, and I just got curious. So I go to my first UFO conference right here in Denver at that, I think it's called the Turntable Building up on I-25, and there I run into Ron Russell, who maybe you were at this lecture too, and back in 1997, and he gives us a lecture, and no one knows who makes these, and they're strange, and I give tours, he said, by the way, you can come with us. And I told Ron about fractals. And he said, sure, come along. So that's how I got into crop circles with Ron Russell, because he was there and he gave us a great presentation about it. Now, the very first crop circle that I encountered when I went there with Ron was by the Milk Hill, the largest and oldest earth mound in Europe. And it was this so-called Koch snowflake. You can see the mathematical pattern that it was based on above. That was the actual very fractal shape that I based my PhD dissertation on, was that shape, where you keep iterating the edges of the triangles and it gets finer and finer and turns into this sort of shape. This is the best they could do with it, or whoever did this, in a field 300 feet across. But that's sort of the idea of fractals, again, is it gets finer and finer. It never really ends, right? So here I'm walking around in a crop circle that is the size of a football field, and in the book they had actually removed ink to save ink. It said middle not filled in to save printer's ink. And so this is a shape I was familiar with, and here it is by Milk Hill. So this really kind of hooked me right away. Then it, that was, it was Silbury Hill, This is Silbury Hill, and then the other one was by Milk Hill. The same season, just a couple miles away. Now, right away from the beginning of these shapes, and back then we didn't know who had made these or how they were made or what they meant. It was just a total mystery, as many of us, believed at the time. There were immediate examples of camera and battery failure in these circles. I saw it myself. This was one, and this is in Dark Matter Monsters, the book that Barry mentioned. Ron had an experience where he goes into one of these circles again by Silbury Hill, and this is Doe Kelly there, by the way. And his compass just started spinning around, and he said it was really spinning around. So that was one of his first experiences. But people experience many things around these crop circles. There are not only camera and battery failure, which I later experienced that summer in '97 when Ron put his Sony camcorder down in a formation near Andover, UK. And it never worked again that summer. We picked it up, it was really hot. Not from the sun, it was really, really hot. And the solder joints had melted inside just from touching the crop circle, apparently. And this sort of thing happened many, many times after that, but that was my first experience of it. But in this formation, Ron went in, he goes out to get more film, and all of a sudden he encounters people speaking an ancient type of English that he could barely understand. They were kind of short and dressed in a medieval garb. And in his impression, he was out at the car for maybe an hour or so, going out, coming back. But when he came back, everyone said he'd only been gone for 5 or 10 minutes. So it's a kind of example of a space-time slip. Now, let me tell you something. Someone like me, as an academic, you hear these stories, you are kind of skeptical of this. I mean, because there's these tendencies in groups to share stories. You all know about this as investigators. And it can become folklore. And I wasn't sure if this was urban folklore. I mean, do people want to believe this happened to them? So the point about hidden events is these things really could be happening, but you have so many biases in your mind from your training and your culture and your religion that you won't believe it initially, because you will think these are just sort of urban folklore type stories. And someone who's well known in this sort of research community even asked me recently why I wasn't treating this kind of like folklore, more than the fact that it was actually happening. But I've learned enough about time slips. I've had friends who've encountered them going into restaurants that didn't exist with a group of people, and the next day it's just not there. Things like this, that I know this is a real experience for people. I've had people take my RV classes who told me it happened to them in Boulder, where they were crossing the road, Arapahoe Avenue there, and all of a sudden it was sort of like 200 years ago, and horses and carriages and barns. And then it snapped back. I've heard these types of stories so many times now, I think it's part and parcel of the phenomena. Again, I want to show you why by the end of this lecture, why I think this is happening. This was a formation we made in Kansas, and we had permission to make a small one. All the photos were really strange. Look at this. Now, it did have some static charge to it, but Ron said that his, I think this was a Nikon F3 camera, never did this before, and I never did it again. It only did it in this crop circle. I don't even know what what's going on there. Look at, I mean, it's just bizarre. That's my head. It doesn't look right. And it's kind of tilted at a weird angle. And Ron insisted this is not light leakage because that camera was a professional quality camera. It didn't do it. It never happened again. So this is the sort of thing we've experienced around crop circles. Even human circle makers, who I finally got to meet in the year 2000, the stories I put in Opening Mind shared with me that they had encountered orbs while they were making circles, enough to scare them out of the field. 3 strong 20-year-old guys with boards running out of the field because orbs. There's a connection even between the human-made circles and orbs and camera and battery failure. And I've been told by several circle-making groups, small UFOs coming over the patterns while they're making them. Small triangles, small types of craft. So there's a connection even to human-made circles. But this is the types of orbs that we've seen around crop circles that have been seen in many different locations. This one was over Woodborough Hill. We were actually back there with Stephen Greer doing a meditation. This was Koch and Kyborg's formation, the German researchers who made human formations to see if they could contact the intelligence that makes these. And while one of their friends was coming to visit us at Woodborough Hill, he saw this, got out, took a picture, and saw this with his eye. So these are the sort of orbs. I don't have any evidence that these literally make the circles, but they are seen around them. I've seen 2 in the UK, one on the ground and one up in the sky, briefly, myself. My first big experience with this camera battery failure came at so-called Devil's Den formation. There's a dolmen there from the Celts. Christians are called it the Devil's Den. But I saw 3 sets of batteries die within half an hour, including these folks who came in with their GPS, Rob Spate and a friend of his. And he said to us, there were 14 hours of battery life. And then it just died instantly. I saw a camcorder of Masao Maki, who owned a sushi restaurant in Boulder at the time, who I didn't know at the time, but he showed up in England and we met each other over there. His camcorder stopped working, my static meter batteries died, all within half an hour around this circle. So very interesting, you look at the pattern there, is that a sort of fractal pattern, kind of nested circles, smaller, kind of similar relationships at different scales. So this was a big one in terms of knocking out batteries, but I've heard it's happened to other camera crews. While I was filming here with the National Geographic Channel, they told me that they knew that the BBC had been out at Silbury Hill and their professional Betacam camera, very expensive, $40,000 camera, something like this, locked up so badly they had to reboot the system, like you were attempting to do a few minutes ago here. They had to call London for instructions. So, to reboot this camera, they'd never done it before. So there isn't any doubt, crop circles, and this is really a mind puzzler for me as a kid who worked with shortwave radio. This is what I would buy with my paper route money, shortwave radio systems, and I was familiar with radio. How could something inert like wheat affect electronics? It didn't add up, unless there was something going on that we couldn't see, right? Because it happened over and over again. It happened to some of the crop circle tour participants that I was with after Ron stopped leading the tour, and I would keep bringing people over there. And we've done it until recently as 2019, right before COVID. She mentioned here how her camera stopped working properly.
Okay. So, and what happened to your camera?
She just describes here. So what she was saying here, after she took a picture on this camera, there should be a photo in the middle, like what you took, and it stopped doing that. So I won't play the whole thing. But it's just people like her that experienced this. This engineer instructor from University of Oregon had something happen to his electronic compass in his watch. Didn't point north anymore. So I've seen this happen many times. Weird patterns show up on your screen. In Pam's camera, it was this all blank where it should have had the picture. In this sort of strange pattern showed up. So there's an effect there. Now, at the time I thought, is this due to what we call metamaterials? You've probably heard of this. These are materials that there's a fine structure in the material that's smaller than the wavelength it's attempting to interact with, and it can bend and change electromagnetic frequencies. The most famous one here being the Morphos butterfly that looks blue, but it's not really blue from dye. It's blue from the metamaterials in its wing structure, changing light frequencies, affecting light, the structure of the light wave itself. Those are metamaterials, and this is a very hot topic in science. You can see in this example from Science Magazine, all these little structures that different creatures have, either for some type of protection, or repelling water, or changing appearance. So I thought maybe it's the structure of the wheat, maybe it's like these photonic crystals, there's something. But the thing about this is these photonic crystals are really tiny. I mean, we're talking at the scale of microns here, right? Nanometers. I mean, just really closely spaced structures, almost as close as an integrated circuit. I couldn't see how that could be happening in the wheat because, the wheat's, we've made a lot of circles over the years, paying the farmer, most of the time. I've had a few, and I wrote about it in Opening Minds. I had a few where I went out with the guys, a few girls with them, and I saw how the circle makers did it. I did that because I wanted to see if those circles were still electronically active, and they were. So, wheat has a certain structure. It doesn't get this small. There have been connections to UFOs, no doubt about it, okay? The Tully saucer nest from the 60s. People saw flying discs, and when they lifted off, there would be this swirled pattern underneath in these marshes. And in fact, Doug and Dave, two of the guys that started the human circle making movement in the UK, one of them, I think it was Doug, had lived in Australia. He was an artist, and he was trying to replicate these in England, which is what motivated him to do it, to see if you could even make something that looked like this. This is how it started. And of course, there's a lot of media attention, and it got bigger. But there is a UFO connection. Now, this woman who I interviewed, who's no longer with her, she's passed on, Louise Vobes, up in Idaho. She described to me being in Usk, Washington, with her brother picking huckleberries. He made huckleberry products. Seeing a flying disc come over the area. There was a mother and a son there too. And about huckleberry picking, you got to get just the right time, and they're not ripe forever and so forth. So it's kind of important, the timing. Classic falling leaf pattern on the disc. And then she said it left really quickly. Whoosh, the sound she made. I made a video of this. You can see this on the Black Swan Ghosts website. You can just watch it for free. She said it flattened the meadow plants as it left. Didn't make a crop circle. But I asked her how flat. She goes, flat as a pancake, 90 degrees. So there is no doubt in my mind that some of these over the years have been made by flying discs, or that flying saucers, UFOs, have the capacity, for whatever reason, from their propulsion systems, from the way that they change space-time to affect materials around them. And she's one witness for me that showed me that this was true. Here's another type of pattern. Oh, this is Colin Andrews, by the way, you're familiar with. Well, in fact, his cameras too. When he came in and was our expert for the week, kind of spent some time with our group, and his camera stopped working. But people have seen interesting structures in crop circles. So this is a Japanese tourist took this picture of a spiral-like form in the center of the circle. It seems to be creating a spiral right around the pollen or the dust in the air. I mean, it's like a DNA-type spiral in the dead center of the circle. So there's kind of these effects of crop circles, which are quite subtle. If you get into this debate, are they human, are they ET, you'll miss this subtle aspect of it. That the shape itself can create this, even if you and I go out and create one. That's my belief about it, based on what I've seen. Colin worked with this engineer who had worked in the aerospace industry, and they said, let's get a magnetometer. I mean, the big magnetometers that you drag across the ground, not a little hand. And they spent all day in this formation at Milton Hill Farms. They saw this sort of offset magnetic pattern from the crop shape. There are 4 circles in this sort of around this Celtic dolmen, and the magnetic changes were really strong, enough to convince them there had to be magnets buried underneath. But when Ron and I located the people who made this, because we walked across the downs that day to find this, and we talked to people in the village, and we found one person who knew something. And we later found the other people who had made it. They didn't put any magnets there. So again, it's the structure of this, very interesting. Even something inert, like you would imagine, like wheat, like an insulator, can create electromagnetic effects. Just some more example of orbs. So this is sort of how crop circles come into it. This is one that I saw that it doesn't look man-made to me. This really looks like some sort of wind vortex or energy vortex that came down from above to create this by Westbury Whitehorse in 2010. So there's a variety. The point I'm trying to make here is a variety of sources of crop circles. Now my conclusion about all of this, which I think you'll see has some relevance for what we're about to talk about with other types of phenomena, is that this was related either to dark energy or dark matter. Now, at the time, my mind thought, is it possible that dark energy or dark matter could even affect us? Well, it turns out it does. There's more dark energy and dark matter particles around us than we thought. I looked this up, and they are these energy types from the cosmos. Dark matter being, the 30-40% of the matter that's out there. Dark energy, 68%. What we are is this baryonic matter is 0.5% of all of what you can see. So I imagine perhaps that the circles were, because of the symmetrical and sometimes fractal shapes, were organizing dark energy, causing it to lens or cluster. This was just an idea I had a number of years ago, and I think it might have something to do with it. People who've been in the circles and who've seen orbs and things like this, it's not just that they experienced electromagnetic and camera failure. They experienced everything that people who've been at Skinwalker Ranch, or as I was talking to Katie before, in Elbert County, in that area, the types of weird phenomena that happen later, like seeing shadow people, having weird time slips, seeing cryptids and things around. It also followed people who've been around these crop circles or in these areas who've experienced orbs. So it can happen from being around orbs and strange luminous phenomena. There are several cases in here which I mentioned in dark matter monsters, but again, it suggests an interconnection between these phenomena where people that are just driving along see an orb or go through an area of light later on have their entire lives changed. In some cases for the better, too. Change careers, they get more insight, they feel that there's a bigger purpose to things. Very interesting. So these two books, when I read these, really connected into these phenomena. I was a little slow in getting to this area. I didn't read Hunter the Skinwalker, even though it's several years old at this point, until recently. But there are all the same effects that I had experienced around crop circles. I hadn't experienced cryptids around crop circles, I have to say that. But there were orbs, there were energy anomalies, and then reading some of these books around people who'd been around these saying that things happened to them. There was a couple named Paul and Sonia, who I wrote about in Black Swan Ghosts, who experienced stuff like this after being on Silbury Hill one night and seeing these really strange light formations, and they claimed beings coming towards that hill that you saw before from across the street for whatever reason. Now, talking to Colin Andrews later, he said that he had been told by someone at a meeting in Washington, D.C. that that field across the street from Silbury Hill had been under surveillance by military intelligence agencies in the U.S. because it was some sort of portal, and beings would just show up out of there. This is what Colin says. Someone came to him at a meeting one time very secretly. The wife passed him a note and said, my husband has to tell you something, but he can't, you have to go up to him. So, and it turned out this sort of thing happens around crop circles too. Well, in any case, reading these books, and then the more recent one, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, really kind of was quite mind-opening to these phenomena, because these same sort of phenomena happen at Skinwalker Ranch and places like this, Marley Woods, which Ted Phillips investigated, which I'll show you slides of in a second. And then if you look at some of the effects around UFO sightings, this particular report I've read through several times because of all the reports of effects of UFOs. I guess we call them UAPs now, whatever they're going to call it this week. Around cars, headlights, batteries, cameras, animals, pets, and things. There was a lot of crossover. And this book, Silent Invasion, which I've really studied very carefully, and I saw Stan Gordon talk many times at UFO conferences. These are about the sightings in southwest Pennsylvania in the 70s. You're probably familiar with this. When I first heard Stan Gordon talk at the the UFO International UFO Congress in Laughlin 20 years ago. I couldn't comprehend this. I couldn't see why Bigfoot would show up around UFOs. I didn't want Bigfoot in my UFOs. I wanted UFOs to be their its own topic, and I heard Stan, and I bought this book, and I didn't read it till recently because I didn't have even in my mind a place to put all this information. Because if you read this book, it's UFOs, then it's Bigfoot, then it's UFOs and Bigfoot in the same fields together, just like this one little excerpt, but it's all like this. Like the witnesses would say, I don't know if it has anything to do with this creature we saw, but every time we saw that creature, the light was pretty close, like this. They seemed to go together to the point where you had Bigfoot coming out of the UFOs. Now, there's so many witnesses Stan Gordon talked about, and they all were repeating the same thing over a period of a 2-year span in Southwest Pennsylvania. Is one case after the other, that you have to assume that there's some connection between these phenomena. And again, even someone like me that's very open to this now, I couldn't quite connect cryptids to UFOs. So I want to convince you by the end of the talk why I think there's actually a connection between all of these phenomena. I'm going to show you exactly why it could actually happen. And it's based on science that really hasn't been shared with us very much, even though it's pretty clear that who's ever been studying the UFOs since, in our government, since Project Blue Book, and it's pretty clear it's been continuous, they know about these things. I will show this to you in a second. But then there's Terry Lovelace, someone I've gotten to know, Incident at Devil's Den. You've probably heard about his case. He has his own. He's been on many channels talking about this. He's in the Air Force. He's a medic. His first encounter in the Air Force was, well, he had encounters as a kid, strange things happening, seeing little beings around and stuff. But one night he's called out as a medic, and they don't tell him what's going on. It's to a missile silo at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. And there's a small triangular craft hovering over one of the silos, as he says. Not the huge type. He said it was the size of a VW bug. But it had caused someone to panic in the missile silo itself and break their leg, and that's what he was out there to do. But they wouldn't let him get to this guy because all the military police are out there pointing their light alls at this thing. And then he said it just shot straight up. That's his first encounter. But the main encounter about this book is when he and another medic go out camping in Arkansas at a place called Devil's Den State Park, and they're taken up by a triangular craft and experimented upon, and they suffer burns and so forth. He told me recently he's not angry about this anymore, but they've definitely suffered some injury. The Air Force afterwards tries to get them not to talk about this. And the thing to me that struck me about this is the silence that he reported right before the craft showed up. He said the insects stopped. There was no insects. It was a sudden silence, which is very familiar to people around Bigfoot sightings, as you probably know, and some UFO sightings. I haven't experienced it yet, but this is what you hear. And so this is, again, sort of a connection. It's a very interesting connection to these. So how do the cosmological factors get into it before I show you what I think is actually going on here? It turns out that dark matter, at least I feel kind of good about this, my hunch about dark matter being involved, or dark energy, turns out to be correct because we've identified one component of dark matter. If I told you we knew what it was, that would not be true. Dark matter is still a mystery. There's 10 dark matter particles for every one particle that we can see around us. But there are people that have looked into this, and we know that these particles called relic neutrinos, I mean, you can look it up in Wikipedia. This is not fringe science or anything like that. There are particles from the cosmic background radiation called neutrinos, relic neutrinos. And while they don't interact with us electromagnetically, they interact with gravity, they interact with objects that have gravity, they flux and lens around big astronomical objects like planets, galaxies, and so forth. And Alexander Parkhomov, in his Space Earth Human book, created a telescope from surplus Soviet equipment. He was someone that worked in the classified Soviet aviation research labs, and curiously enough, in their remote viewing program, which I guess is not surprising since they had 21 remote viewing labs in the Soviet Union. 21. he created a telescope that would measure this and would kind of focus these low energy neutrinos. Now, these neutrinos are not like the ones from the sun, which you may have heard about, which are very fast and very small and rarely interact with us. They're so small, we're told they could go for 10 light years in lead and not hit anything. These relative neutrinos are not like that. They have a wavelength, so-called de Broglie wavelength, a quantum wavelength, of around 3 to 4 millimeters, microns, 3 to 4 microns. So they interact with cells and molecules and things like that. So they interact with us. And the estimates are they're interacting with us like 10 million times a second. Not as much in here because they are affected by things that we would be shielded from them right now. But Parkhomov found that these would affect biological reactions, chemical reactions, even the variance of radioactive decay, which according to standard physics is very constant. But the variance of atomic decay is varied by time of day and exposure to these relative, based on where the Earth is in the entire cosmos. This is something, by the way, that Claude Swanson talked about in a lecture I just saw reviewed again from about 10 years ago to the SSE. In any case, these low energy neutrinos seem to matter and seem to interact with us. They are a component of dark matter. Now, even the skeptics, like people like Ethan Siegel of Forbes magazine, you've read his articles, he's kind of like what Stanton Friedman would have called an anti-anti person. Okay, he's sort of against anything like what we're interested in, anything paranormal, but even he admits these relative neutrinos are a 0.5 or 1% of the dark matter out there, and that's a lot more than even 1% of dark matter, because there's so much of it, is more than all the matter you can see. So we know these are lensed and fluxed around planets and physical matter in the Earth, and they seem to affect cold fusion, so-called cold fusion reactions, LENR. Interestingly enough, the connection to RV is that in RV we know about something called local sidereal time. And the people in the RV program who started this at SRI for the government, also at DIA, noticed that local sidereal time affected viewers' accuracy. It's apparently 4 more times accurate. It's more accurate by a factor of 4 during the sidereal time of 13.5 hours. When our planet, when you're facing the Virgo cluster, which is in the direction of a lot of dark matter out there, and the so-called great attractor, when the Earth is on the other side of that, the viewing accuracy goes down. I didn't actually believe in this until Ed May showed us all the graphs at one of the RV conferences. Well, it turns out that there's a connection between local sidereal time and dark matter, which is something that Claude Swanson figured out about 10 years ago, and I think the Russian and Soviet scientists knew about, but it's still sort of new to us over here. So that's some sort of way that relative neutrinos, if you can imagine something subtle like remote viewing, being affected by some sort of cosmological factor. And there's beginning to be measurements of it, but it's something that is out there that actually can affect us and seems to be a catalyst for these low energy nuclear reactions. Orbs, ball lightning, all these factors are actually being influenced by something coming from the cosmos, which is really interesting if you think about it. Even something like Pear Labs, they would note that Pear Labs was at Princeton, initially started by people in the aerospace industry wanting to know if pilots' emotions could affect the machinery, jam it up, affect your electronics at a critical time. And I think it was McDonnell Douglas that funded Pear Labs in the beginning. A lot of this comes out of the aerospace industry, as I'm about to show you, though it's classified, and it's because they want to patent it or whatever. So it really hasn't been shared with the public very much. In any case, Pear Labs found also very subtle effects with psychomicro-PK, another sort of effect where you would affect a random number generator to make it to generate more ones or zeros. They found about 2 or 3 events per 10,000 flips, which is actually quite large. Anyone could do this. They found that bonded pairs, people that were in a relationship, would affect the machine more than people by themselves, or just 2 unrelated people. This is actually another very interesting effect. And even someone like Boyd Bushman, who we've all heard from in the past, Lockheed Martin, talked about dark energy, this dark neutrino universe, almost like an invisible universe around us that was linked to all these gazillion neutrinos that are around us all the time, and to dark matter. So I think you can see where this is going, is that there's another type of universe around us that we can't see that outnumbers us 10 to 1. It outnumbers baryonic. Baryonic means visible, ordinary objects. Even other physical objects out there in the universe, most of it's non-baryonic, which means it's invisible, again, by a factor of 10 to 1, about to visible matter. So when we look around us and you think you see what's going on, you're actually only seeing a tiny little portion of reality. And there's a whole line of research in this. We'll take a little break in a few minutes, if that would be good. But I want to...
certainly by 3.
By 3. Let's take a break at 3. But let me introduce you to this. This goes all the way back to Tesla, and I think this is what's going to connect all of this. At least it does for me. And I'll see if you agree with this or not. I mean, we know Nikola Tesla was working with alternative types of energy, with these so-called pulse disruptive discharge devices, those huge, coils and things he'd be working with, either at Colorado Springs because of the dryness, or in New York City. He was known to blow out quite a few transformers. People have been looking into this for the government ever since then, as you're probably aware. One of them was Winston Bostic, who was a researcher at Stevens Institute of Technology, I believe in New Jersey, then later Caltech. He was looking into some of these phenomena with a grant from the Air Force, and what he found was he could recreate what he believed were miniature galaxies in a test tube. Even the New York Times did an article on his galaxies in a test tube. He creates a universe in a test tube. And if you look at these articles, it's fascinating. He's creating these sorts of plasmoid type shapes. Now, what we're looking at are a type of matter that's one step beyond the gases that we see, solid, liquid, gas. One step beyond that are ionized gases, which create plasmas. Plasmas are the most abundant type of matter in the universe. They make up fluorescent bulbs, lightning, aurora borealis, and all that glowing stuff we see out there in the universe. These are plasmas, okay? That's the fourth state of matter. And Winston Bostic, he had a grant from DOE, and he was also secretly funded by the Air Force, because at the end of this article, it says he was funded by the Air Force, even though it really wasn't shared very much with the public. His idea was to have peaceful uses of atomic energy, of fusion energy, and that's what he was hired to do right after World War II, was to see if we could use this. And Bostic realized this could be used for propulsion and so forth. So the idea that he created is that the same forces that create galaxies out there, and these spiral barred galaxies, are the same shapes you could even see in a test tube in plasmoids. So it's very interesting research. Next after Bostic was Kenneth Shoulders, who was a colleague of Hal Puthoff's eventually, initially worked at MIT and then did classified research for the NSA at SRI. Microelectronic masking. All of the electronics we use nowadays, the way the circuit boards are created, came from the work of Kenneth Shoulders at SRI. He was working on drones before the word existed in our vocabulary for the government. He had an idea for a flying helicopter. But Shoulders was actually looking at the work of John Hutchinson in Canada, the inventor that had these fractured metal samples. And Shoulders was the one that realized there was a connection between Bostic, John Hutchinson, and Tesla, which is these charge clusters, as he originally called them, electron, vanadium, strong electrons, finally settling on the name of exotic vacuum objects. This is an exotic vacuum object coming apart in a vacuum chamber. Exotic vacuum objects are created anytime you get a cluster of charges that goes so beyond the Coulombic barrier that there's an attraction there, that really strong attraction that keeps compressing and compressing and compressing the charges until they form a fifth state of matter, coherent matter. So the next step past plasmas, are magnetically confined plasmas, self-organized plasmas that keep holding together. In other words, ball lightning and orbs. And this is what Kenneth Shoulders realized that he was looking at microball lightning. Microball lightning creates fractal structures when it moves through a material. Not the Coke snowflake we saw, but kind of more of a random type fractal pattern. The closer you look at this, it looks the same at any pattern. This is the remnant of microball lightning that Shoulders created in the lab moving through a metal plate or something like this. And it would create these chains, these bead chains, too. These sort of toroidal shaped patterns. And it turns out that everyone who's looked at this has basically come to the same conclusion, that these charge clusters, highly compressed state of matter, where it just keeps compressing and compressing because the attractive force is so strong. It goes way beyond, we were all taught in school that like charges repel, and we're all familiar with magnets repelling on the same side, and electrons. Well, that's at large distances. When they're really compressed together, they form a coherent, self-organized, macroscopic, quantum coherent object that we call orbs, we call ball lightning, and so forth. But here's the real kicker. So many people that have looked into this have concluded that it's interacting with another type of universe that we can all refer to as dark matter, dark universe, something like this. And this is what Shoulders just says. If you read his papers, it just blows your mind over and over again. When seeking a physical analogy for the driving force behind this process, which occurs to produce, there's a dark ball lightning state too. We'll get into that in a moment. In the absence, he called them black evos. In the absence of disturbance, a pressure analogy can be evoked. A driving force is seen to occur between the higher pressure side of our white universe and the other black universe residing in a lower pressure region of space. It might even be appropriate to signify that the black universe identified here is the much touted dark matter regime, which is said to dominate in quantity over our normal matter. Now, this is what the Soviet and Russian researchers found too, but we're slower to get to it here in the US for some reason, maybe because of classification. I'm not sure exactly why. But basically, there's a connection between dark matter and orbs, and there's this feeling like once you're creating this ball lightning, that all ball lightning and orbs are interacting with dark matter and another type of universe that we can't see, which is exactly what Lakatsky and Keller and Knapp write about in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, is encountering all these dark-shaped orbs on Skinwalker Ranch and things that seemed scary, things that absorbed all the light. Well, this is exactly what you find at a macroscopic scale in microball lightning lab-created orbs and so forth. And it gets even better than that, because there are actually things we can measure about this. What Shoulders argues here is that ball lightning orbs, microball lightning, actually changes the permittivity of space. Permittivity being one of the fundamental constants that determine the speed of light. And permeability, the magnetic component, and permittivity, so-called dielectric constants, they get lower and lower and lower in ball lightning and orbs, which means their speed of light would be different than ours, and you would be getting electrical activity. Permittivity being the resistance of a material to have an electrical field at all. And you can imagine things like wood and plastic and rubber have a high permittivity because they're not easily made electrical. They're kind of insulators. And things like metals and superconductors being the lowest permittivity. Well, Shoulders is the one way back a couple decades ago that says that we're getting changes in permittivity, and the objects that have a lower permittivity are sort of in their own universe. They're superconducting, and they may interact with our universe, but they may not interact with their universe. And so you look at some of the writings in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, and they talk about approaching this menacing 8-foot-high black shape that just seemed to absorb all the light around it. They're looking through it with their night vision equipment, 3 of these DIA analysts. And you look at what they're saying, and then you look at what Shoulders said. He says, the black EV seems to lack states that couple into our region of normal permittivity, our normal reality here. They create their own form of superconductivity, But they're bounded by their own high permittivity. They're bounded by a high permittivity space, so there's a shielding effect. And within this cocoon, the black Evo slides around on its own. So so-called these objects that at Skinwalker Ranch are identified with paranormal phenomena seem very similar to these low permittivity orbs, compressed matter, and so forth. That Shoulders is working with Bostic, Tesla, John Hutchinson, a host of Russian researchers going back decades, and even the Japanese researcher Takeaki Matsumoto, who we didn't hear about until recently. And you heard about Hutchinson. I mean, Colonel John Alexander went up with his group to study John Hutchinson, to investigate. He writes about this, Alexander, in his really good book called Reality Denied, which looks at a lot of these phenomena. Hutchinson was just attempting to replicate Tesla's work at a laboratory scale, not with these huge pulsed discharge coils and tubes and things, but kind of at a smaller scale. And he does. He creates these fractured metal samples, which, again, melt metal at room temperature. No heat needed. This is at room temperature. Embeds coins in them. Now, initially, people thought this had to be a hoax, but this turns out to be real because everyone else who's researched cold fusion LENR, including Fleischmann-Pons, find these same effects in their labs, too. John Alexander couldn't tell at the time. There was a skeptic in his group that came up with them. But this turns out to be replicable by other labs, including Matsumoto, Parkhomov, and others. And once you get materials like this fifth state of coherent matter, we're not talking about melting from heat. We're talking about melting from coherency, from resonance. And isn't that what Tesla said, that everything comes down to sound, frequency, and resonance? This is what it looks like. And I'm sure you've heard other people lecture about this, but it took me a long time until recently to understand what is going on. This is coherent matter. If you were to touch matter like this, it would not be hot. You could put your finger in it and leave your fingerprint at room temperature. It's liquid because the electrons have correlated with each other. They're not in their normal state like they are in ordinary matter, and they're fluid and they're flexible, and they're floating around at room temperature, and you get metal melting and bending like this. People who've seen ball lightning go through trains and things have said they could put their finger into the aluminum frame and they could push their finger in, but it was cool to the touch. It totally defies our idea of common sense, doesn't it? That melting's associated with heat. Well, it turns out, and we'll take a break in just a minute after I introduce this idea, another researcher in Japan that I just mentioned, Takeaki Matsumoto, looked at all of this. He concluded that what we call cold fusion, the Fleischmann and Pons reaction from Salt Lake City, is actually microball lightning, and at the core, microscopic black holes. And this is a photo of a remnant of what the black hole left behind. These are not black holes that are going to swallow the Earth like the CERN reactor. You don't have to worry about these. These are bounded in the structure and they collapse on their own. But even someone working on his own in isolation in Japan, a nuclear physicist, came to the same conclusion as the American and the Russian researchers, that we're dealing with alternate states of matter that can couple to dark matter, that create black holes, and even, get this, generate their own dark matter on the other side. You get one type of dark matter going in, the relic neutrinos, and that they can be emitted by these objects also, which I think is actually what PK turns out to be, cold neutrinos. Same frequency, same energy as relic neutrinos, but the neutrinos can really oscillate in flux and form. But when they're emitted by a biological organism or a cold fusion reaction, they actually put pressure on things around them. They act like relic neutrinos, but they're being generated right here in the moment. And this is what Matsumoto concludes, which is, and we'll go into more of this after the break, it's the same thing as Bostic, Winston Bostic, that the same forces you have out there at the galactic scales, the same forces producing black holes and galaxies and so forth, are working in the lab at the small scale. That essentially what we call cold fusion is actually the same thing that's going on in a black hole at a larger scale for slightly different reasons, but it's actually the same effect, a type of compression. So interacting with dark matter, relic neutrinos, so forth. So there's just so much commonality between this research I'll show you in a moment why we can look at defense contractor patents and see the same stuff in their patents that we haven't publicly talked about, but they're using it for propulsion systems. They're actually already tapping into these quantum effects. So let's take a little break, and then we'll come back with 10 minutes. So I want to show you how I think this all links up, and it's surprisingly to Bigfoot and cryptids too, having talked to witnesses right here in Colorado of their experiences with Bigfoot right in the mountains right here behind us. And how this all links up to these phenomena, the real evidence that what we're looking at are the real, I'm making the argument here we're dealing with the same fundamental processes that from Tesla, and it was before Tesla. A lot of the people that were working on Tesla's technology, we know it now as his technology, some of us do, not the mainstream. They perished in World War I in the UK. It was being researched before Tesla, the same types of reactions. Dusty plasmas and so forth, these controlled plasmas. This is what we're talking about here. So let's continue on with Matsumoto, and I'll show you how this relates to these phenomena. So he called what we called cold fusion, and in cold fusion, you'll be familiar with it if you're not already from the work of Fleischman and Pons at the University of Utah. Remember this? And they have a press conference. They didn't want the press conference. The university wanted the press conference to show prior knowledge for patents. This was their motivation. It wasn't their idea. Fleischman and Pons. Fleischman has an interview with Michael Tinsley from Infinite Energy magazine in '96, where he says we didn't want to have a press conference. That's what got him in trouble, because normally in science you have peer-reviewed process and publication, and the university wanted to rush it because they wanted the patents. So in any case, we called it cold fusion. We know now it's not literally cold fusion. This is not neutrons fusing together like we hear about this recent announcement from the DOE a couple weeks ago about some breakthrough in cold fusion, hot fusion at Lawrence Livermore Labs with their lasers. But what they didn't say is it takes so much energy to get those lasers going to get just a couple joules of energy out. It's not efficient by any means. Yeah, once the lasers are working, yeah, for that brief second, it's going to produce more, and maybe you could get a self-catalyzing reaction, but it takes so much energy, like about 100 times more energy to get the whole processing going in the first place. It's still not doing, it's still 10 years away, like we've always heard. Okay, that's the hot fusion process. The cold fusion doesn't literally seem to be like fusing neutrons in hydrogen turning to helium. It actually seems more what Matsumoto discovered, which is it's a cluster of different particles, including the neutrinos. It's definitely a clustering process, so probably low energy nuclear reaction is probably a more accurate term, which is what it's referred to as now. But when Matsumoto was writing this, it was called cold fusion. Anyway, Matsumoto sees this as a microcosm of these galactic processes, the same types of gravity. He called it electronuclear collapse, a type of gravitational collapse. And by gravitational collapse, we're talking about a different gravitational state within these orbs and microball lightnings, within these condensed plasmoids, as some people call them. It's a different gravitational state. We don't have this type of gravity we experience around us, which is why we say it's a type of gravitational collapse. And then Matsumoto also explains that this electromagnetic force, at a galactic scale, you see black holes out there and different types of white dwarfs and neutron stars, another type of condensed matter from gravity. When it happens in a lab at the atomic scale, and a lot of these researchers believe it's happening in us all the time right now anyway. It's what makes biological life possible. It's 40 times stronger because it's electromagnetic than a gravitational type of effect. And it still creates a black hole-like thing, but it's from electromagnetic compression, not from gravity. Now, once you have this type of compression going on, I'm going to argue here, you get all these effects you see at Skinwalker Ranch, the other places that we've seen strange paranormal effects. You get a type of nucleosynthesis, like some of the Ukrainian researchers, Vysotsky and Adamenko, talked about. Here's an example, and I'm sharing this from Bob Grenier and the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, who I've learned a lot about this from watching Bob's YouTube videos for the last 2 years, studying this. You get alchemy, nuclear alchemy, something we were taught in school is impossible, but here you have lead coming out of a pure carbon ball. Explain that one. That's gone through a LENR process. It's coming out in a spray. from the center of the lead ball. It also comes out sometimes in films. And so many researchers from Japan to Soviet Union to Russia, the United States, it's all the same. Ukraine, they've all discovered the same effect. You get this transmutation of elements. All the elements in the periodic table. It starts from hydrogen, going down through helium, going through aluminum, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, all the elements that are very common on Earth. And it generally stops at lead, which is the heaviest stable element. But if you keep pushing it, you'll end up with radioactive elements, which is unfortunately why some of these researchers have gotten cancer and perished, like Ken Children, because you create an unstable process. But it doesn't have to go that hard. You don't have to push the reaction that hard. It generally likes to stop at lead. And even Mark Leclerc, who was out here a number of years ago at the Boulder Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference, I remember him giving this lecture about how they, from their water, you can create this LENR effect just from cavitation. It's actually possible to reproduce this from things that you can buy. Ultrasonic cleaners, you could just buy them on Amazon and recreate this effect. You would see it if you had an electron scanning microscope. Leclerc talked about using this sonoluminescence to create this cavitation, which creates this sort of ultrasonic collapse. And in that collapse, you get the compression. It's another way to create a LENR effect through cavitation. He showed us how he had created all the different elements on the periodic table, just starting from a few elements at the beginning, like carbon. And you end up with all the elements in the periodic table. So this is called nucleosynthesis. And again, Leclerc drove it too hard and he ended up getting cancer after that presentation so you have to be careful with this. This is not something just to fool around with. Often the pattern in these charge clusters, these exotic vacuum objects, look a lot like crop circle-like patterns. This is just from the Michael Solon patent from Russia, and he applied to the US Patent Office. I don't think they actually granted this patent. But you look at the drawings of the impact of these charge clusters on materials around them. And I think that what I'm saying here would be verifiable if you looked at some of these materials at haunted sites, at paranormal sites. If you started to find some of this, it would be evidence of this type of reaction going on, if I'm correct about this. You end up finding these types of patterns. Now, what are they created by? They're created by these toroidal shapes that are fractal based. Remember we talked about fractals at the beginning? It's coming back in a big way. Just wait for it, okay? This is the big shock of my life. These objects aren't three-dimensional objects. They're toroids made of smaller toroids, and each of that toroids made of smaller toroids. You kind of get it? They're like clouds. I should have explained in the beginning, something like a cloud has a fractal dimension of 2.3, 2.2. Why? It's not totally there. The closer you get to a cloud, you go in an airplane, you see it's made of droplets. So it doesn't totally fill the space. It's in between dimensions. These toroidal shapes that create, that are the shape of ball lightning. Some people have seen ball lightning that looks like this, and orbs can look like this, and exotic vacuum objects under the microscope, the witness marks that are left behind, look like this. But it's not from a donut. It's from a fractal donut. And this is why it's called a fractal phantom toroid. You'll see more about this in a minute. We're going to really drive this point home. These are fractal objects between dimensions that are creating huge amounts of energy, and ball lightning and orbs and all of this, as I'm arguing here. Ball lightning, if you look at the research about it, there's so much research going back hundreds of years. People have been studying this for a long time, folks. It's not just us. It can come down chimneys. Chimneys have a lot of carbon on the inside. Ball lightning's attracted to carbon. This is why it's attracted to people and animals, by the way. It likes carbon. There's a lot of loose electrons around carbon. It for binding, and they've been known to come. These are historical diagrams. You look at ball lightning, it's been around us a long time. People like Francois Arago from France, a politician, physicist. Back then, people did like everything. Politician, lawyer, and physicist. Had a whole report on ball lightning. Walter Brand did one in 1923 in Germany. He talks about ball lightning teleporting animals and people in this think about it, okay? It can sometimes explode. We were just talking, Barry and I, someone here in the audience has had ball lightning. It sometimes can go through you. I don't recommend it. I corresponded with a witness in Pennsylvania who was blown backwards by one when he was working on a gutter and it came out of the sky. They don't, okay, here's the mistake people have made. They don't always show up by thunderstorms. That's one way you can get this compression that produces ball lightning. But as Freiberger shows us from DOE-funded Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, the same sort of argument, it's a type of magnetic compression. He calls it a vorton. And he says it's created from nonlinear electromagnetic forces, Maxwellian forces. Normally, electricity and magnetism are, the fields are at 90 degrees. Freiberger argues that if the angles are different, you get these nonlinear, non-ordinary electromagnetic effects, which are ripe for ball lightning. He calls them negative, non-ordinary pointing vectors, the pointing vector being ordinary. Electromagnetics, it's sort of a different type of electromagnetics. What you and I are familiar with is ordinary electromagnetics, where things do what they're supposed to do. Needless to say, these processes are not friendly to electronics at all. They do not work well with electronics, which any structure that's going to create these non-ordinary electromagnetic, so-called, they call them diality angles, electricity magnetism fields, do not play well with electronics, but orbs like it, and ball lightning. And this is DOE funded, folks. And it's just the same as Matsumoto or Shoulders or Hutchinson or Tesla. There's different names for this. Freiberger calls it a vorton, but it's this same very condensed magnetic field, which condenses and clusters charges together. And non-ordinary diality angles, what he calls a diality inversion. Closed pointing vectors. We're going to see this in a second from Soviet research. John Archibald Wheeler, the famous physicist that was really interested in gravity, this sort of relativity effects, general relativity, as sort of an explanation of reality over quantum mechanics, had his own name for it. He called it a GEON. Gravitational electromagnetic entity, something like that. This is from the 1950s, same toroidal shape. He said between these electrical charges was these intense magnetic fields. And by the way, he happened to be the supervisor of Hugh Everett III, who invented the multiverse idea back in the 50s at Princeton, even though Wheeler was not very supportive of it because he was friends with Niels Bohr. And they had their Copenhagen interpretation, which is that reality collapses when you look at it, which you've all heard of. But Everett said maybe all the realities exist simultaneously and you're only perceiving one, which created the many worlds idea. John Wheeler was his supervisor, and he was into these GEONs. And what is this line between the toroid? Gravitational effects, propulsion. You can see the Air Force's interest in this even going back to the 50s. Controlled propulsion from toroidal magnetic shapes. It's what Bushman was talking about in the slide we looked at, who worked at Lockheed Martin. Now, all of these types of toroidal shapes are a form of coherent matter where all of the electrons, if that's what it's made from, are coherently linked to each other in a type of macroscopic arrangement. And this sort of particle was discovered recently at NIST down the road at CU, the NIST labs over there, the so-called Bose-Einstein condensate. You've heard of this, where the electron wave function of each particle overlaps to create one big electron, right? And this is not something that anyone disputes anymore. Bose and the Indian physicist Bose and Einstein discover this jointly in 1925, and it's called the Bose-Einstein condensate. It can only exist at absolute zero, minus 300 Kelvin. It doesn't exist at room temperature, and this is what they found at NIST, is the particles come together, lose their individual identity. They're called monochromatic. They're at the same frequency, at the same temperature, and they form one big electron in your lab there that you can look at. It's a fifth state of matter, a kind of coherent matter. But the big news here is that Bose-Einstein condensates can exist at room temperature too, and that's what I think, and some of us think ball lightning and orbs is actually the same thing, but at room temperature created by a different process, rather than cooling everything down to absolute zero, where there's no energy left and they all the particles become one. If it happened in this room right now, it'd be really weird. We'd all join up and just be one big particle. But nature doesn't want it that way in ordinary reality, right? You can do it in the lab, but that's what an orb or ball lightning or micro ball lightning is. Now, there's some articles about it recently you'll see in Science magazine, and they got like 1,000 particles together, and this is what it looked like at a very low temperature. So it's sort of like a larger single quantum state. But this seems to be what ball lightning already is. And if you think some of this might be like fringe science or woo-woo, you have to think again, because it's in the Lockheed Martin patent from 2013. Systems for methods for generating coherent matter wave beams. And they're talking about all of this stuff. They're talking about teleportation in this article, cloaking, invisibility, directed energy weapons, you name it. The whole host of quantum entangled projected effects that you could get from a macroscopic quantum object. And they're boasting in here, we don't need to do it at minus 300 Kelvin, we can do it at room temperature. We can create these effects for weapons, for communication, and for invisibility. Right here in this patent, that the patent office said, yes, this is real. They granted in 2021, just 2 years ago. And they talk, I won't read the whole thing here, but they talk about creating something like a laser, but with ordinary matter. Bosons, particles that stick together. They say it's 1,000,000 times more powerful than a laser. And they're boasting of cloaking and invisibility and teleportation and all of this cool stuff. If you think this is some sort of science fiction fantasy, Lockheed Martin and the patent office disagree, okay? It's already real. It's called coherent matter. And it's right here in this patent. It's based on the good old Aronoff-Bohm effect, that spooky quantum effect that is postulated by David Bohm and his student Yakir Aronoff from Israel. Now, Aronoff, I just found out recently, no one would sponsor him on this effect. Aronoff believed that if you had similar quantum potentials, you could have spooky action at a distance, like quantum mechanics predicted. Things interacting at distances without putting any energy into the system. That's what this patent is about. Creating effects at a distance without injecting energy from what? Coherence and resonance. They use the analogy right in this patent, if you read through it. It's really fun. Of flocks of birds and fish. The murmuration, the way flocks of birds and fish will form a coherent pattern. There's no leader. Nobody knows quite how they do it. They say we can do that here in a similar analogy, but in the quantum realm, with groups of particles, with no leader, and no energy being put in. In fact, you're subtracting energy from the system to do this. They argue you can create this by subtracting energy, but if the resonance is right, you could make things coherent, you can direct all sorts of energy processes through the Aronoff-Bohm effect. Now, Aronoff couldn't get any support when he initially proposed this, and he silence your phones, please.
Silence your phones.
No, that's coming from Zoom. That's cool. That's the Aronoff-Bohm effect right there. Spooky action at a distance. That's it. But Aronoff couldn't. You remember David Bohm? He wrote that book, The Holograph. What was it? He created the idea of the holographic. Michael Talbot wrote that book, The Holographic Universe. I think a lot of us read that back. Yeah, that was based on David Bohm's idea of the implicate order and all this. Well, this is a real quantum effect, and it wasn't until Aronoff ran into Bohm in the UK that Bohm said, I think that's kind of cool, because Bohm was already kind of interested in these ideas. Bohm was later, he was expelled from the US because they thought this was too similar to communism in the 50s. And he went to Brazil, and later I think he settled down in Israel. Even though Einstein was a friend of his and tried to get him back, he was expelled from the US for having other political ideas. But that's the same.
Was
David.
that during McCarthy?
Yeah. The same thing happened to Robert Oppenheimer. There's a new movie coming out about it. And he was just redeemed a couple of weeks ago. The DOA apologized to the Oppenheimer family and said they mistakenly took away his security clearance for his, he wasn't happy with what the atomic bomb turned into, even though he was their lead scientist. And the DOE said he was just expressing his First Amendment rights. They shouldn't have taken away his security clearance. He wasn't. Anyways, this mattered back. Even Edward Condon at CU, who does Condon Report.
Yes.
He had his security clearance removed for being involved in quantum tunneling, Quantum tunneling was considered weird, spooky action at a distance, and he had to testify in front of the HUAC committee in Congress, and they said, don't you think people that believe in revolutionary scientific ideas might also be adherents of revolutionary political parties? Yeah, that's what we had to live with back in the 50s. And it affected Bohm. And so we've always been living with this it's a type of persecution of new scientific ideas. In any case, Aharonov-Bohm effect is this kind of very interesting effect. Just think of it like flocks of birds and fish. And it's based on vector potentials where there could be no energy in the system. You go out there with your magnetometer, the stuff that I like to go out in the field with around crop circles, right? You're not going to measure anything, but it's in the math of the quantum potentials. The objects will be coherently locked at a distance purely from mathematical reasons. I'm talking imaginary numbers. But no one believed it would be an effect, but it's been measured now and shown to be true over and over again. So here's Lockheed Martin saying we can turn coherent matter into a coherence and produce matter waves that are 1,000,000 times more stronger than a laser. We can do it with bosons, which are particles that like to be together, and fermions, which are electrons, which normally like to be apart, right? Repulsive. We can do it with any type of particle. We can create coherence with resonance. So this is what a lot of these phenomena come down to. Now, you remember Tom Bearden wrote this book about very strange effects that were seen over Soviet nuclear test sites. And there's a declassified CIA document. This is just a couple pages from it. It showed these weird luminous phenomena in the atmosphere that were seen by pilots. You've probably heard people talk about this. It was seen around missile test sites, and they thought it was some sort of Soviet Aharonov-Bohm type macroscopic quantum defense system. Some sort of scalar effect, right? Been seen many times around their testing systems. But this is the interesting thing. John Ramirez, who you've heard recently talk, former missile analyst, analogous to what James Lukatsky did, but Ramirez was in DIA. He said on John Greenwald's channel and many other places that the CIA looked into these sort of sudden cooling and spherical luminous objects over the Soviet Union and so forth, and concluded they were being caused by UFOs coming into the atmosphere that they could see with their keyhole satellites that were launched in the 70s. He said just go to Wikipedia and you'll see the whole history of the keyhole satellite program. But he said the keyhole satellites could detect invisible objects too. They had sensors to detect infrared and so forth. And they concluded, he says, at the CIA, that UFOs could have a plasma form as they came into the atmosphere that was non-physical. That UFOs literally, and I guess this isn't surprising to people like us who've investigated these subjects, that there's a plasma-based form and a solid form, even though our minds may not want those two things to go together. That's what Ramirez said they found in these programs that he said he was asked to be in, but he didn't want to go through all the security clearances. So some of the people that worked in his program got the security clearances and looked at ORB, a CIA-sponsored ORB program, and a CIA-sponsored UFO program. And Ramirez said right here on the Greenwald's interview that when they came back, they looked at the little gray alien little figurine he had in his desk and said, it's all true. That's what Ramirez tells us, now retired, and he said they haven't bothered, CIA has not bothered him for talking about this. So it turns out all to be true, all of this. It's just we're seeing if we can figure out why. So Ramirez says that those orbs are a type of UFO. That wasn't Tom Bearden, it wasn't a scalar Soviet weapon, it was an extraterrestrial effect. That's what Ramirez tells us. I can't verify it. But this is where it really gets interesting. And this is what really brought it all together for me, was these Soviet scientists who were working in Soviet programs about these effects, Aharonov-Bohm effect, macroscopic quantum effects. One of them was named V.E. Zverbelis. We just came across this document about a year ago from classified Soviet research, so this isn't widely known. And it was translated into English by the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project and Bob Greenyer. And they talked about these toroidal donut-like shapes being able to generate ball lightning and orbs for days at a time, even once the experiment was turned off. And he talks about going into this classified program in Moscow and seeing this, what appeared to be an electromagnetic phantom, an object glowing over a laboratory surface. That he replicated it. He said it looked a little bit like this. These are the coils of wires. Do you remember that fractal toroid shape I showed you a few minutes ago? He initially thought it had to be a hoax until he started looking into the mathematics and talking to some of his people that he knew, Nevesky, another top mathematician in the Soviet Union. And this was happening right when the Soviet Union was collapsing in the early 90s. So they were able to talk about this. They called it an electromagnetic phantom. And he said that even once they turned off the experiment and took the physical lab equipment away, this shape remained glowing over the tabletop for 2 days. You could brush it away with your hand, and he said it was reminiscent of orbs and ball lightning, right in this article. When they looked at the mathematics behind it, and I have a replication of this in Dark Matter Monsters that I had an artist that I hired to reproduce this. These are fractal electromagnetic toroidal shapes. Remember we were saying at the beginning of this lecture how fractals are objects that in smaller levels it looks like the larger macroscopic object. Well, this is what they found created these fractal electromagnetic toroids, was increased fractally related electromagnetic fields. These closed pointing vectors, as we talked about before, where you have an electric field, then the magnetic field, but in the magnetic field you have more electrical fields, magnetic, electric, varying all the way down to the 0-point field. This is what they concluded. It just keeps going down and down and down, all the way to the smallest quantum level it could be. And when you create a technology that looks like this, it'll create orbs and ball lightning right there in the lab. The closest you can actually create a shape like this with wire is those kind of looping, twisted shapes that you saw in the previous slide that looks like this, which is his replica of it. So when they looked at the math that would describe it, what do you think they came up with? Koch snowflake fractal. It's the only shape in nature that can completely fill space-time, is the Koch snowflake fractal. So here they are back in the 90s talking about the same shape that I'm looking at in my dissertation and saying it's actually the secret to creating these persistent ball lightning orb type phenomena. The record, the Soviets said they could keep these going for months at a time, not just 2 days. That's what Zverblis saw in this basement lab. But apparently when you create fractal shaped electromagnetic processes, they connect into the 0-point field itself directly. This is what the Soviets believed, and it could create all the way down to infinity. You see the infinity shape there. And it could create orbs and ball lightning and macroscopic quantum effects. Now, I imagine the Soviets probably wanted to turn this into some sort of weapon. And as we know, that it was such a corrupt, inefficient political system, and none of this got developed outside of the lab, which I think we're very fortunate to know this. But this is fractal Maxwellian field structures. And now we know what it is, and the Soviets figured this out decades, I think, at least as far as I know, before we figured it out. And this is what fractal toroids are, focused donuts. They're not really there in the sense that the closer you look, the more detail you see. It never completely looks like a solid object. But because it's fractal shaped, it sort of ends up filling up all the space, all the way down to the smallest level. So these are fractal toroidal structures. And this is what can create all these spooky effects. And I'm arguing here, and you don't have to agree, that this creates a lot of what we call paranormal effects too, is objects and life forms, living things that are based on these sorts of processes and shapes will have persistent glowing luminosity around them, whether they be UFOs or cryptids, as we'll see in a moment, or around crop circles, or even RV sessions, because one of the earliest experiences I had with orbs is when an RVer said an orb came into the room while they were doing a session and floated over the page, and he said it burnt his hands when he touched it. It was hot. It was a discharge of some sort. Now, we're all familiar with To the Stars Academy, and we just had the NDA report and a New York Times article, which I haven't read yet, just from yesterday, that I'm told is more favorable to this subject, and we had Tom DeLonge in the Hal Puthoff was one of the people in the To the Stars Academy, and he gave us a lecture in Las Vegas at the joint IRVA, International Remote Viewing Association, IRVA SSE, Society for Scientific Exploration, which has often been held in Boulder, the joint meeting. And he told us that he had been involved in these UFO programs ever since Project Blue Book. They hadn't been canceled. He mentioned that memo from Carol Bolender that said that the really good, juicy reports never went to Blue Book. They were classified immediately. And I know two people that worked in Project Blue Book, by the way. And they told me that there was an entire room that the public never saw where all the good stuff was, all the good UFO photos. They told me the people that worked back there, and I've never been able to get them to say too much more, except that one of them said they were allowed to go into the Blue Room one night at Wright-Patterson, but they will never tell me what they saw there. They said it would break the security agreements they made. Even all these years later, I don't know if that's true, but. So I know people that worked at Blue Book, and there was more going on there, but Hal argued in this lecture that these programs had continued all the way up through OSAP. He said ATIP was a nickname for OSAP. You can listen to the lecture, it's on YouTube. And he mentioned these bismuth magnesium samples, right? That they felt might have been part of a UFO crash retrieval. I've talked to other people that have handled materials like this, not these materials, and I'm told that these crash materials are 100% real, and they're made of a technology that we don't understand. Even in Black Swan Ghosts, I had an engineer from this area. You probably know him, Phil Catalano, who said that the aerospace company he worked at, associated with JPL, that they were given materials one day, and that JPL said, well, we don't, the owners went away. We want you to figure out how it works. And he said, everyone looked at this and they said, this isn't our stuff. It's just too fine, not the bismuth magnesium, and really fine, dense scale electronics that we can't make yet. The point of this is that Hal argued that these materials change permittivity, which we talked about a few minutes ago, literally change the speed of light. And Hal called it space-time metric engineering. Now, I'm arguing here that this is all space-time metric engineering. It's vacuum engineering, as Kenneth Shoulders called it. Ken and Hal work together. It's no surprise that this space-time metric engineering is the basis for some of these UFO technologies, it appears. And it's such a huge topic, we can't say it's all this or that, but some of it seems to be space-time metric engineering. Because, this is what I want to show you. And this is what Hal showed us back then in 2018, and I've been researching it ever since, is that the speed of light, which we're always taught is constant, 300,000 kilometers a second, well, it's based on these physics constants, the dielectric constant of permittivity and permeability, which is magnetism. And this is exactly what Hal told us, someone who had worked in these classified UFO programs since Project Blue Book, as he said right there. That if you change permittivity or permeability, the speed of light isn't the same, which is why Hal argued a lot of these UFOs have a bluish tint to them, because their speed of light is a little faster because the materials allow them to lower their permittivity. Just like Ken Shoulders said, surprisingly, in that article we looked at a few minutes ago, right? You can vary the permittivity of the materials, which means their speed of light's different from our ordinary speed of light, which means the object will either be heavily blue shifted or red shifted. It won't look quite the same. And I think if you kept lowering the permittivity, these objects would start looking truly weird until they wouldn't even be visible to us anymore. They would be in a different frame of reference, as Einstein would refer to it as, right? I think that's what's going on here. Now, it's very interesting if you look into Einstein's work that he was proposing a variable speed of light after he got his Nobel Prize. He didn't pursue it because he was so well known for general relativity at that point in the Nobel Prize and special relativity that he didn't want to apparently, and he didn't get good acceptance to the idea that C was variable, but that's exactly what Hal told us in this lecture in 2018 in Vegas. And we know from Ken Shoulders that these exotic vacuum objects, micro ball lightning, have a much lower permittivity than ordinary materials. Well, all of this is going to look very paranormal and weird when you're around it, just like Ken Shoulders talking about these dark EVOs. By the way, Ramirez said that plasmas have a dark state too. He said they would see them come into the atmosphere and become invisible. So what it means is that a lot of electromagnetic processes that have reduced permittivity, they're not going to be visible to us, which may be why at Skinwalker Ranch and other places like Skinwalker Ranch, which Katie and I were talking about at the beginning here. Even in Hunt for the Skinwalker, they mention a place by Yakima, Washington. They mention the ranch in Elbert County and other locations. And you want to know when I first heard about this? It was a lecture by Chris O'Brien at a joint conference with Stephen Greer in Crestone in 1998 or 9. There was a mini conference there with Greer and O'Brien talked, and it turns out in Hunt for the Skinwalker, they said he was the only civilian allowed for a long time by NIDS on to Skinwalker Ranch. It was Chris O'Brien. And that's how he knew so much about it in 98. I was kind of wondering, he was talking about Bigfoot and Dogmen and all these creepy stuff out there. And the entities that 9-foot tall spacemen left boot prints this big, and their ships would come in and knock off the top of the cottonwood trees. I heard all about this, I didn't know how to make sense of this 20 years ago, folks. It took me a while, I'm slow. But I think it has something to do with this change in primitivity, the space-time metric engineering that Hal argued extraterrestrials know how to do. And we're still figuring it out. Even Chris Mellon from this, you've heard about slide 9 that someone lifted off his computer when accidentally it was for a congressional briefing about OSAP. And he talks about all these effects. It's even say at the top that these are ATIP subfocus areas. Cognitive human interfaces, telepathy, mind speak, right? Psychotronic weapons. I'm sure the Soviets were big into that one. Penetration of solid surfaces, hello. Think about all the missile tampering and events at SAC bases, Northern Tier, all that penetration. Instantaneous sensory disassembly, that would get your attention. We've heard about this from pilots. They would go to use something and the UFOs near all of a sudden stop working. I don't know if this happened to the Nimitz pilots. We've heard there were some other effects there, but I've never heard any detail beyond them seeing the object. Manipulation of biological organisms, anomalies in the space-time construct. Hey, space-time slips on all of that. So, Chris Mellon's already talking about this because we know from all of this NDAA that there's a classified side to that report that we heard about from Bill at the beginning, right? There's a classified version of this. This is the declassified version. That's why it's not very satisfying. We know that Congress has had classified hearings because Kevin Day and others have spoken about testifying in front of those hearings. And you can see why they'd be alarmed by this. This is all the consequences of having the ability to create these metamaterials. This is what they are, metamaterials that change the space-time construct, space-time metric engineering. And even here on the Mellon slide, he talks about the DoD having access to properties where they can study this. I would imagine this is Skinwalker and Elbert County and the other ranches, right? That's why OSAP went out there, according to Lekatsky. And again, Nevesky, the mathematician that worked with Sverdlovsk, the other Soviet, and they're both passed on now, the other Soviet researcher who thought this was some sort of hoax when he saw this in a Moscow basement, said that just the chiral shape, the spinning shape, the circular shape, the toroidal form of electromagnetic fields could interact with us. Just that toroidal form, which is, again, something that Claude Swanson talked about a long time ago, but I didn't understand at the time. And there is some evidence for this recently in insects that fruit flies have this toroidal magnetic shape in their brain that allows them to navigate. So we're already built around some of these shapes. Now, this wouldn't be surprising because pretty much everything that humans discover, nature, like Leonardo da Vinci argued, everything that we discover scientifically or technologically, nature has already built it in somewhere. So if we're just rediscovering coherent matter right now in space-time metric engineering, you would imagine that nature is already using it somewhere in us or in some animal or creature. If it's in fruit flies, it's got to be in mammals too. And we're talking about fractal toroidal structures that detect very sensitive magnetic changes and so forth. So here's why I think there's all these similarities before we go to questions like that. It's because these things look really similar. This is a picture from the Marley Woods, which Ted Phillips, Ted Phillips, the associate of J. Allen Hynek, who did thousands of trace cases, his final research ended up, as far as I know, was about Marley Woods in Missouri, this ranch in Missouri. And he called these the ambers. And if you listen to his presentations at the Ozark UFO conference, which you can find around sometimes on eBay, some on YouTube, I mean, he's talking about all the strange effects that you see at Skinwalker Ranch and every other portal area. It's all the same thing. This is some of the orbs. Look at that strange little shape it makes at the end as it's moving across the field. Does that weird non-linear turn there. This is the same thing seen at Project Hestelin. I've communicated with them and they're fine with me using the pictures, in these presentations. They had these orbs too. And Freiberger, who I mentioned before from Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, argued that these Earth lights and ball lightning are all the same thing. Whether they're at Project Hestelin, Skinwalker Ranch, Marley Woods, you name it, it's all the same as a coherent type of magnetic compressed phenomena, condensed plasmoids, as some people call them, or exotic vacuum objects. And there are different names for this and there's slight variations, but they're based on the same principle of coherent compressed matter. These are just some of the images from Project Hestelin. I mean, I know a lot of people believed these were UFOs right at the beginning, but there's evidence from the soil around here that these are a type of ball lightning from the silica in the soil and these little structures I'll show you in a second that you find around Hestelin and in labs that do LENR experiments, the same crenellated iron spheres. And they can do very interesting things that make them look sentient. And I'm not ruling out that they are in some way. I'm just saying, even from the science, they can look really sensitive and sentient to electromagnetic fields. This is Project Hestelin. These are the orbs that people see there on a regular basis in that valley. Cameras were set up and so forth. T.R. Durrani went out there, and his paper, if you read it about ball lightning, he says it looks like a UAP. His paper is recent enough to use that language. He says it looks like a UAP. It looks like a UFO, but it's not. It's ball lightning splitting into 3 separate objects with that red light on it. But it's ball lightning. So there is this real crossover where you would look at that and think it's a structured object, but you can see the sequence of lights here where it's an orb turning into this structure. But I mean, we can't rule out that there's some intelligent control here. It would be a very interesting debate with ball lightning physicists and those of us interested in the UFO UAP phenomena. Is there intentionality here? I mean, who's controlling this? I can't resolve it. But these ball lightnings orbs look a lot like UFOs a lot of the time. And we were talking right at the beginning of this meeting about ruling out most of the report. You could rule some of them out with ball lightning. I'm not saying it rules it all out. I'm just saying some of it looks really weird and it has a physics explanation. Now, this is what's really interesting. There's real physical correlates to what I'm saying here. I can be proven wrong. Exactly what I'm saying. I'm open to that. It's fine. But where you get ball lightning, you get these crenellated iron-rich spheres. It's from that. It's an effect of transmutation where the iron changes the shape and it compresses and it has this very crenulated pattern on the surface. I would be very interested to see if you have this at Marley Woods or Skinwalker Ranch or anywhere, because this would be indicative of orbs and ball lightning. It's been found in micrometeorites too, but not from the meteorite, from the cavitation they used to clean the meteorite off, because cavitation, Mark Leclerc, creates LENR processes, low energy nuclear reaction, compression. You get this. You see this in LENR experiments in labs where they're working with cold fusion LENR. You get the same thing you found at Project Hestelin. So I'm wondering, where else do you find this? And if you didn't find this at Skinwalker Ranch and Marley Woods in Elbert County, then this would prove sort of what I'm saying here wrong. So we need to do some research on this. But I imagine anywhere you have these processes going on, you're going to get this nuclear transmutation. You're going to find elements that you wouldn't expect to be there, and these crenellated spheres. Now, you get these sort of impact marks, which look sort of like melting or a micrometeorite, but that is literally a transmutation, gravitational collapse of the material. It looks like melting, but it's not from heat. It's from this quantum effect of this object literally rearranging the atoms of other materials it comes to contact with. You can see on the other side, there's another little mark. It shows that it's from a toroidal type shape too. These toroidal shapes move through things and they leave what's called witness marks. Here's another example of it from a transmutation type experiment, which has been called Omaza gas, oxy hydrogen gas. and it creates this sort of transmutation effect, which these researchers argue is a macroscopic quantum effect. Now, this is from the Barnesville, Minnesota UFO event in 1964, again, part of that Strange Effects of UFOs from NICAP, and they have some photos. It looks very similar to the LENR coherent matter effect to me. So maybe that's what it is. I mean, we don't know. But even if you read the research, this was proposed to be ball lightning, and it was none other than James McDonald. Bless his soul, James McDonald, who said there were no thunderstorms that day, so it couldn't have been ball lightning. Well, we know now that, I mean, McDonald was an atmospheric scientist, right? Ball lightning doesn't only show up around thunderstorms. It can show up in many different circumstances if you read the literature. So maybe this was a ball lightning type effect. A lot of those cases in that NICAP report, just some of them do seem just like glowing orbs, but it's extremely strange. It definitely is extremely strange. So just to finish up here, let's see. Okay. This is dangerous, sort of, it's potentially dangerous phenomena. And Lutz Jaitner at this International Conference on Cold Fusion in 2019, guys, it's a very good lecture on YouTube. He calls them condensed plasmoids, which Shoulders called exotic vacuum objects, are pretty much the same thing. And he confirms what Shoulders found, but he warns us that, and see if this sounds very similar to what Lakatsky's talking about at Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Condensed plasmoids can damage biological tissue and pose a health risk. They talk about these people who had orbs go through them and later got cancer and different types of ailments. As happens to people, sometimes people can get very sick after having ball lightning go through them. You don't want it to go through you if you can avoid it. Sometimes it's harmless though. It can pass through walls of LENR apparatus. This is why some of you have been thinking, if cold fusion is real, how come we don't have this infinite energy device right on this tabletop right now? I have found out why this doesn't exist yet. The condensed plasmoid, the charge clusters, they're so capable of nucleosynthesis, they go right through the wall of the reactor. It's very hard to contain them. This is why in the hot fusion experiments, these very expensive $1 billion reactors, they have these Theodore Geiger-like magnetic coils because you're trying to contain it from going through the wall of the reactor, which it inevitably will do. But it's so powerful that it goes through anything that it's around, and they haven't found a way to contain it in cold fusion experiments, which is why they don't last for more than a few months at most, because they don't seem sustainable. Maybe someone's found a way to do it, but that's generally been a challenge, is how to contain the charge cluster, the micro ball lightning. And then they emit soft X-rays, UV light, so they're not really safe to be around for a long term. They can destroy electronic components, I think we've seen this before, and they can ionize all matter, which looks like melting. So here's where it gets interesting. How does this link up to Bigfoot? Well, the biggest shock to me when I went to the Bailey Sasquatch Outpost, who are having their own meeting today, which we couldn't attend because we're here, but in Golden. Okay, so someone had given me, and this is sort of what led to writing Dark Matter Monsters and all this, someone had given me these Bigfoot socks, and they said there was this museum in the Sasquatch Outpost, and I actually didn't have any interest in Bigfoot at the time a couple of years ago. In fact, people in my RV class told me in 2019 they organized a field trip to the Sasquatch Outpost, and they invited me, and I turned them down. This is how quickly things change. But I eventually did discover it just one day, turning in a different direction over there in Bailey. Instead of going down 285, I went to the left, and all of a sudden you see that huge Sasquatch. And I said, what is, this is that museum everyone was telling me about. Went in, and that's when I realized that people were having a lot of experiences, even in this area of Colorado, right, in the foothills. I didn't realize how prevalent this was, because I had listened to Lauren Coleman on Art Bell years ago, who said it was a rare primate, and it was rare. In the Northwest, and a couple thousand of them, and I just thought it'd be something I'd never encounter, and most people wouldn't. And if it was just a relic primate, that wouldn't be a huge story. I mean, we can accept that there are rare animals, and maybe there's just a very smart ape out there, but that's not what it turned out to be. Because this phenomena, the Sasquatch, Bigfoot, are seen in every state, even Hawaii. I've heard witnesses who've said they've encountered these in Hawaii, and pretty much every country. It's a hidden event. People don't talk about it because they're afraid of being ridiculed, as I found out. And so I started looking into it more and more. I didn't know that even where I live in Boulder, there were encounters right up at Chautauqua Park by people who didn't talk about it for 10 years, but eventually reported it to the BFRO. And that you read more about it, you look more about it. I got to meet Igor Burtsev, who's probably the most well-known Russian researcher of Sasquatch. In Russia, they call it Almasty. And they have a whole branch of research, formerly in the Soviet Union, called hominology, the study of other types of humans. And that's Don Monroe on the left, who's a US researcher. And what Igor told us really tied it into all these phenomena, because I just didn't realize this was going on. He said he first thought it was the Gigantopithecus relic primate, and then they realized it had a language, it was way too smart. People were reporting going back to somewhere where these Sasquatch live, spending time with them. And then strange electromagnetic effects around the Sasquatch. Burtsev described objects floating in the air when the Sasquatch would come around their research van, even heavy objects, light bulbs coming out of their sockets, the engine starting of their van with no battery. They were using the battery for heat, and it started anyway when the Sasquatch came close. And he said they eventually concluded it was a paranormal human. He had witnesses who said it became invisible right in front of their eyes, like a kind of like light sparkling curtain came down, it was gone. Same sort of thing we see here, very large, massive, sort of hair-covered bipedal creature, but they concluded it was a type of human with special abilities. Not the Gigantopithecus that we've heard from mainstream anthropologists in the US. There is no evidence Gigantopithecus was ever in the US, and they've only found the teeth and the jaws of the Gigantopithecus. It didn't stand upright, as far as anyone knows. And there's no evidence it came across the Bering Strait. But if you look at all the evidence for Sasquatch, I mean, this is another big debate, but it seems to look like a primate but act like a human, and people that interact with it feel that it has the intelligence or even more intelligence than a human. So it's a real mystery. We're all familiar with this footage, which I should say, I did see this back in the 70s, around the time of that sighting in the Everglades, at a movie preview, when I was about the same age, and there was Patty. She's called Walking Across, 300 frames, Bluff Creek. Now, the Batterson and Gimlin were basically like two cowboys from Yakima, Washington. They did not have the resources to hire a special effects artist to do it. This is real, as far as I'm concerned. This is the real deal. It's a female, their breasts on this particular Sasquatch. The main thing to me that interested about this is the electromagnetic effects. Talking to witnesses in Colorado, they told me their cameras would stop working, batteries would stop working, like Igor Burtsev. They had time slips. One of the witnesses that I know, Lauren, who I wrote about in Dark Matter Monsters, mentioned just going out on a trail in Estes Park, and all of a sudden 3 hours have gone by and they're back in the parking lot with the other guy she's hiking with. They don't remember anything in between there. You know, if you look at Sasquatch researchers, they will say the moment they make contact with the Sasquatch, all of a sudden they're back in their truck. Some time had gone by, they don't remember walking back as soon as they were going to take a photo. And this is what Igor Burtsev told us. Now, I wouldn't just believe it because Igor had said it. It's far away, Russia, from us. But it's what the American researchers said too. Even David Paulides mentions these supernatural effects from the newspaper articles that he's, found, that he's put in his research from 100 years ago. They said the Native Americans refer to it as a supernatural creature. And they talk about these hair standing on end when you're around it. This particular YouTube video was very interesting, where the people saw a small Sasquatch like a juvenile, or it looked more like a monkey, which is what a lot of people report. They think it's the small one's a chimp, escaped gorilla. If you look in the literature, people refer to these as escaped gorillas. There can't be that many escaped gorillas in the US. But people, they didn't know how to refer to it. Wild men, even the Vikings encountered tall bipedal hair-covered creatures that could howl and smelled really bad. So we think they encountered. But in this video, you look at the camera, it's all pixelated. There's nothing there. They saw it with their eyes, but the camera doesn't pick it up. This particular group I was with at this Sasquatch Bigfoot Adventure Weekend just last July actually saw a bunch of them. My group didn't. We didn't. It was the quietest night ever, and not in a weird way. Not the insects being quiet. There was nothing happening in our part of the forest that we went to near Bailey. But this group, a couple miles away, did see them through the thermal imagers Jason Frank, who's a Bigfoot researcher, did put up some of the thermal image footage that they caught. And one of these women was a very good vocalist. She was able to make some sound. So they apparently did contact something, even though we didn't see it. But it was that tall. They said it went up to the head, was at that branch. Okay, so we're talking about the same sort of creatures. In this particular case that I read about in Rusty Wilson's book, this woman who was a wildlife recording artist with her partner, who was a former ranger in Yellowstone, they reported the Bigfoot giving off sparks as it came towards them. Car would not start. As I said, as the Bigfoot looked in the car, trying to get away, blue lights coming off the creature into the car. Blue sparks are coming off the creature. It's really electromagnetic. And the car wouldn't start until it walked away. It had to lean, the thing was leaning down to look in the window. They went out there because there's no one there in the winter and it's technically closed, which is why no one else said. But this ranger, Dan, knew about it because he had worked there. Any case, all of this suggested to me, also the glowing eyes. I have an interview on the YouTube channel. A woman, I read her story after I did an interview, and I contacted her after seeing these comments. She said it had glowing yellow eyes. A lot of these Sasquatch, the eyes emit light. It's casting light onto the ground. Maybe it's photoluminescence, or maybe it's LENR. It's some sort of, as I said earlier in the lecture here, I wouldn't be surprised if nature already incorporates these condensed matter processes into living organisms. If that's true, this would be Bigfoot. It's already using it. When you listen to reports of Bigfoot encounters, people say it seems to be gliding over the ground, like the Flatwoods monster from 1952. Gliding over the ground, floating. They say the head doesn't go up and down like we do when we walk. And you listen to reports of people who've been picked up in their sleeping bags when they were camping. There was a case like that at Mount Rainier. The guy said there was no up and down motion. The Bigfoot was carrying for about 30 seconds before his girlfriend saw what was going on and screamed. The Bigfoot put him down. Whatever the motivations of the Bigfoot are doing that, and that's a whole nother subject. He said it wasn't going up and down. It was floating across like a jet over the forest. So this to me suggests, just like Igor Burtsev, paranormal human, or now that I look at it this way, coherent matter human, something that has harnessed these powers, psychokinesis, the gliding, the anti-gravity effects that we know happen from LENR, that some life form, animal, human, whatever it turns out to be, has already mastered these effects. And it explains the invisibility. People describe, and I talked to a nurse up in Idaho who worked with a lot of loggers in hospitals over the years, from the old timers from the 40s. They would say, and they would never talk about it, but they told it to her. They didn't want the logging operation shut down. That they would see the head pop out from behind a tree, but when it went back, they'd go behind, there was nothing there. So you hear these reports. Now, initially, when I heard this a couple of years ago, even me, Stan Gordon, 20 years ago at the Laughlin conferences, I just couldn't make sense of how could something physical go invisible. Well, it all sort of makes sense now. It's in the Lockheed Martin patent. So maybe Lockheed Martin isn't the first ones to figure this out. Someone, and this is why Sasquatch can do this. Ted Phillips reported these same effects at Marley Woods. They had cryptids there. You've probably seen this, but they described something like a polar bear, the size of a polar bear weighing 300 to 400 pounds. The rancher shot at it to no effect, and then it walked through a fence, physically through a barbed wire fence. It left hair, which they examined, and they couldn't identify it. No lab could identify what animal this was. It's kind of like Sasquatch. In Sasquatch, according to what I understand, you can identify human mitochondria, which comes from the female side, but you can't identify the rest of it. It's unknown. So there are hair samples. So and your mind's probably boggling by this. How could it leave hair sample be physical? Because it's resonant. When it's at our frequency, it looks like us the way we look physical, but when it switches frequencies, which you and I don't quite know how to do without a lot of training, as far as I've gotten is remote viewing, okay, and I've seen psychokinesis demonstrations. If you switched frequencies at another sort of octave or another overtone of that, our frequency, it would sort of not be here physically, but it'd still be here energetically, like that fractal magnetic toroids we looked at. So, sort of here, sort of not. Anyway, the interesting thing is Ted Phillips, when he talks about these orbs, he said he saw one go over a picnic bench, which is chained to the ground, and it lifted up in the air. it started jostling around as the orb went over it, which fits what John Wheeler thought about these toroids creating a gravitational effect. It all sort of comes together. I mean, if I'm wrong about this, I'm wrong in a big way. So, but to me, the way we are as modern people, we don't multiply principles beyond necessity, right? And if we want to simplify things, not make it too simple, we'd have to agree that some of these phenomena seem pretty similar. The anti-gravity effect of the orbs, they show up around these cryptids that can walk through walls and sometimes just become invisible. I was talking to the owner of the Sasquatch outpost recently, and he said while we were driving out to that Bigfoot watch at the Bigfoot Adventure Weekend, he said there were a group of hunters that, he said people go through the museum there, Sasquatch outpost, and they tell them stories. They said, we've never told anyone this, but we were out hunting. This was a group of hunters in Pennsylvania. He said, we heard something coming through the brush that sounded like a locomotive. How often have you heard this? Like a tractor coming through the trees. I don't know if it's actually breaking branches or not, but it sounds like a tractor coming through the forest. And they all had weapons with either lasers on them or flashlights to see what they're looking at. At one point, they're getting really frightened, so they say, okay, everyone, raise your weapon. Okay, boys, light them up. They raise their weapons. They've got lights going on, and there's nothing there but a blue mist. But a few, before it sounded like the hugest creature you could. I know people have heard this coming through the forest. It sounds really huge. I don't know if the Bigfoot are doing that on purpose or if I don't know what effect this is. Would you actually find broken over trees as they came through? I haven't heard that's true. So they can also sound like car doors slamming and metal objects hitting each other, according to Ron Moorhead from the Sierra Sounds, which you've probably heard. You can hear them online. Sierra Sounds, he recorded 9 different occasions up there in the Sierra Nevadas of the sounds that they make, even them talking to each other and him communicating back and forth with them. Ron Moorhead said he could never see them. They should have cast a shadow on the hunting structure. There were cracks between the logs that they used to build it. The microphones were in the wall. You listen to the Sierra Sounds, you hear them chattering back and forth. They sound like they're there, but Ron said they'd go out quick, nothing. He only saw one once far away going into the distance in 9 visits up there, starting in the 70s. So here's one of the most, I would say the most experienced witness we know, Ron Moorhead. He wrote the book Quantum Bigfoot and Voices in the Wilderness, which are both really good introductions. He also describes these weird macroscopic quantum effects. He said at one time he saw something that looked like a Star Wars lightsaber going through the forest. Another time they heard like a tuning fork right over the hunting structure, and at other times they saw orbs. Les Stroud, Survivor Man, Bigfoot. He encounters these creatures up in, I think in Alaska, the sounds of Bigfoot, and he gets interested. He hears some trees rustling, hears the yelling. He creates this 10, 12-part series called Survivor Man Bigfoot, which is on YouTube. Les is really great because he puts it all on YouTube for free because he's the producer and he wants people to watch. He went out to Oregon, Portland, Oregon. It's the bonus episode in Survivor Man Bigfoot. And he said they saw orbs. They never saw Bigfoot, but they saw orbs. This woman said the Bigfoot drove over. They saw orbs. And then he heard mind speak in his head. And it was so disturbing to him, he went to a psychologist to see if he was going nuts. And the psychologist said, so this telepathic mind speak is another aspect of the Sasquatch Bigfoot. And maybe other cryptids that we don't even have names for, because we only have names for, there are encyclopedias of cryptids. I've often wondered about the slide rock bolter, which the miners up in Rocky Mountains, this area, reported. I don't know what that was. They said it would come down really quickly from slide down. I'm not sure what that was. It was almost slide right down the rocks. Who knows? But so the mind speak is another thing, and this is the interesting thing to me about it is even people that didn't really believe in this, they report it. They report the Sasquatch talking to you in your mind, in your trailer or house, telling you to come outside. They want to meet you. They seem to like to socialize. Honestly. They're related to us in some way. I don't totally understand what they are, but they seem to want to interact with us. I don't know if they're responsible for the missing 411. We'll have to wait and see about that. Not all the Native American tribe descriptions of them are positive. Even the Navajos I was with, and I worked on the Navajo reservation in one of my college summers. I spent a lot of time out in New Mexico. And there were some Navajos at the Bigfoot Adventure Weekend. I said, what's your translation for Bigfoot? They said, huge monster. And they told me about a case where a 5-year-old disappeared herding sheep way back in the 40s. And everyone went to look for her and they couldn't find her. And they thought she was just gone. A couple days later, she comes walking out of the woods and they said, where were you? She says, I was with these big hairy creatures. And they said, bear. And she said, no, they walked on 2 legs and ate food like we do. And they just wanted to hang out with me for a couple of days. I asked if she was still alive, and they said she's passed on, so it would have been a good person to interview. But in any case, it's quite a mysterious subject. But to me, the interesting part of it is this witness in near south of Estes Park. Is it Drake, Colorado? She said her cameras and her iPhone just totally lost charge. As we were talking about Barry before, it charged the next day again. But she described feeling this mind fog for a day and a half. She said exactly a day and a half. It was this feeling of mental confusion. Is it the infrasound that people feel they might emit, these frequencies below 20 kilohertz, or is it being around a condensed, matter-based life form? I mean, being near a black hole would make you feel weird too. Now, I was saying this to Barry, and I should mention it. Ball lightning normally won't magnetize things and affect equipment from a distance. It has to pass really close by you too. But if it does pass close by, it's going to have really large effects. But at a distance, it won't have really huge effects. So it can magnetically charge things and rearrange electronics and stuff, but it's usually when it comes closer. But it even has to make you wonder about that famous Skinwalker event where the bowls were found inside that closed storage container. I'm not saying this is true, but we know that this type of object can teleport living things a couple feet away or farther. So was that an intentional act of a negative entity, or was that a product of orbs? Remember that other case where the Shermans described, and that's how Chris O'Brien described them, as the Shermans. He didn't use the name Gormans, which has been used recently to hide their identity. He described that case where the blue orbs come out and the dogs are chasing the orbs, and it's coming closer and back and forth and back, and eventually Sherman goes out the next morning and finds they're just puddles of fat where the dogs were. Now, again, some people assume that there's some sort of negatively intentioned entity there. I just want to propose the alternative, which I can't prove, is that this is what orbs do. They have enough energy. They're not physically hot, but there's just if you read about how much electrical energy is in one of these coherent matter objects, it's vast. It's millions of times more than ordinary matter. And if it releases it all at once, it's going to feel like being electrocuted. It's killed people occasionally. And I'm just wondering whether that was a case of ball lightning that's very sensitive to electrostatic charges. This is why it moves down the aisle of a plane right in the middle. It's sensing the static charges of the seats, and it's just... So this is just another possibility that this is not always an intentioned entity. In any case, I've certainly talked enough to you today. Thank you for listening. I just want to conclude, what's the summary here? Well, we already had people like John Brennan from the CIA saying, there might be some type of phenomena here that's the result of something we don't understand yet. Some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life. We're already sort of getting it from these folks. And think cryptids here, too. They must know about this. Someone must be keeping track of all these Bigfoot and other cryptid encounters. I would be so surprised if someone wasn't keeping tabs on this. So what are we looking at here? These sorts of objects that we talked about today in process are all based on resonance, just like the Lockheed Martin patent. We know what resonance is. It's like 2 tuning forks. You hit one, and I always use this example in the RV class, but it's still the same thing. You hit one, the other one, if it's at the same frequency, will just start spontaneously ringing. And you could put more and more tuning forks in the room, and they would all ring. It's not like it's an effect that gets exhausted. It's not a zero-sum effect. So it's a resonance type effect. That's what we're dealing with quantum coherent matter. Resonance. And overlapping phenomenology, which is the ball lightning researcher Tier Durrani. He even admits some of these ball lightning look like UFOs. They move in ways, and we can't rule out exactly what's going on. There's just too much overlap. whether it's a UFO or if it's a ball lightning or if it's a mix. And even Ramirez says, the ball lightning they saw come in, the UFOs they saw come into the atmosphere with the Keyhole satellites turned into plasma and then went dark. So what is this? And is it overlap? I think that's a good term, overlapping phenomenology. At least it makes you sound smart to say something like that. And finally, I think these are the fundamental principles. I mean, you could have a different point of view, but based on all my research for 25 years since I discovered remote viewing and going back to fractals even earlier, is that coherent objects are based on fractal-shaped processes like that. The Koch snowflake, like the phantom fractal toroid, like the Soviets discovered, these kind of self-similar objects that go all the way down to the smallest scale we know. When you get coherent fractal objects, whether toroidal shape or maybe in other shapes, it leads to changes in permittivity, which changes speed of light. All the other fundamental constants in physics that are based on permeability, permittivity. And those sorts of objects, whether they're technology in the hull of a UFO craft, or it possibly, as I'm suggesting here, in life forms that we call cryptids or paranormal humans, those sorts of changes would make them seem very weird to us. They would literally seem to disappear in front of our eyes. They would seem to be able to morph, to cloak, change shape. People report Bigfoot changing into tree stumps, boulders, so forth, right in front of their eyes. Maybe this is what it is we're dealing with coherency, changes in things like permittivity, which we were all taught is a constant, but actually we know from Hal Puthoff and others that it's variable, which leads to changes in the way the universe works, and it would look really weird and spooky, but it's actually based on these sort of basic principles. So I think that's about it, folks. I think I've said enough. Thanks for listening. I will be back there to sign more books in a few minutes. Any questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you
Challenge
just want to
me.
use a microphone and ask
You are welcome to challenge me or say anything you want or disagree. I'm open to all of it.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Project. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And again, no meeting next month, but we'll see you in March.
I just got a comment.
Sure.
Back on, something triggered in my head, back on the crop circles, even when you knew guys made them, you saw the weird electromagnetic effects. And I'm wondering, the Earth is a very, very powerful electromagnetic generator. Nobody on the Earth makes anything as powerful as the Earth does itself. And I'm wondering if just by simply bending over the stalks of wheat, it creates an antenna to where those, the energy can be focused, that's part of the Earth. And the same thing with a lot of these phenomena in different places. We do have this really powerful electromagnetic generator. Maybe the geology or the shape of the terrain, those things combine to create these effects.
Right. I think that's an excellent way to look at it. I think that's very likely to be true. And that was some of my initial thinking about it. It's like a piezoelectric effect. I mean, you're bending over wheat. It's a living plant, and it's in a pattern now. Very helical, chiral pattern.
The shape of things matters.
The shape matters.
You can throw a handful of Legos in a microwave. It doesn't do anything. To throw a piece of bacon in there, it won't last a minute.
Exactly.
So
Shapes matter, and crop circles look a lot like liquid crystals, with all those little grains pointed in the same direction. So I would agree with that. I think the shape itself matters also, and that's a big part of what's going on. Yeah.
I have a question.
Like an antenna, too.
I've got a comment
Go ahead.
also. You know that Patterson film of the Bigfoot?
Yeah.
I heard somebody talk the other day and they said that was filmed with 16 millimeter. No electronics whatsoever, and that's why their camera was not effective.
Right, the most basic camera, right, 16 millimeter. How many people had 16 millimeter cameras out back then? I mean, yeah, 16 millimeter film. Yep,
That's why I said,
Very
let's go
basic.
back to those again.
probably. And the thing is, a lot of these modern photos of Bigfoot, there seem to be a lot of good ones out there from trail trends. If you look around, you'll see these.
Yeah.
But they do seem to be kind of blurry or weird, and you kind of wonder, is it that interaction with electronics that they didn't have with the
That's
16
what this guy
millimeter
was
film?
saying, yeah.
So our sophistication is actually, not a good thing.
Detrimental.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I heard on Art Bell that Bigfoot is like a prisoner from another planet. They keep him down. Every once in a while, just let him run around.
Maybe that's why it's seen around the UFOs. They're letting him off the UFO for a little while. People have, no, honestly, people have suggested the reason you see it on Bigfoot is maybe they're abducting Bigfoot too, and then we see them when they're let off the craft. I don't know, it's a possibility. But my thinking is more than there's some sort of indigenous hominid to the planet too, related. Anything else? Okay. I'm happy to talk more in the back of the room for a few minutes, so thanks. Thank you so much.